gold tycoon in America in 1850. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 626, President in Troubled Times. Douglas was solemnly saying to Lincoln, "Abraham, no, Mr. President, our union is in the most difficult moment in history. Integrity and unity are the prerequisites for America to become a strong country. The efforts of the ancestors should not be buried in the hands of our generation. In this critical time, nothing is more important than unity and patriotism. Mr. President, I and all the Democrats in the North support you. May God bless you and America." Douglas' words moved and inspired Lincoln and the Republican leaders present. Indeed, America needs unity more than ever before. Douglas's statement shows that the Northern Democrats have recognized Lincoln as president and the legitimacy of the Republican Party's rule. The support of the Northern Democratic Party is now too important for Lincoln and the Republican Party. "Douglas, I thank you from the bottom of my heart and thank you for your support. Your support comes too timely. The Lord will bless our great country and us," Lincoln said gratefully. There were also many factions within the Northern Democratic Party. Lincoln, who was also the leader of the party, knew that Douglas had done a lot of work within the party and persuaded many members of the Northern Democratic Party before the Northern Democratic Party reached a consensus. Douglas did not say much. After expressing the attitude of the Northern Democratic Party to Lincoln and the Republicans, he said goodbye and left without making any political demands. "I have something important to do, so I won't bother you. Goodbye." After Douglas left, Lincoln said to everyone with emotion, "Douglas is really a man of noble character and sensible. We blamed Douglas wrongly," Wells and Dayton said ashamedly. Lincoln was greatly encouraged by the support and recognition of the Northern Democratic Party. The situation was not that bad. At least the free states in the North were still united. On February 5th, Abraham Lincoln and James Buchanan walked out of the Willard Hotel where they were staying hand in hand and boarded a luxurious black four-wheeled carriage together. A group of elite guards with live ammunition guarded the carriage in front, behind, left and right to protect the personal safety of the two presidents. The presidential motorcade drove slowly along Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol, the iconic building in Washington. To ensure that Lincoln's inauguration ceremony could proceed smoothly, Colonel Sumner, who had already entered Washington, arranged elite shooters on the roofs of every house along Pennsylvania Avenue at the instruction of Secretary of War Scott, and 4 companies of infantry were responsible for maintaining street security. To prevent any unexpected events, Scott personally commanded 2 light artillery companies to be stationed on Capitol Hill, and General John Ewell, Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Army, led an infantry regiment and 2 heavy artillery companies to be stationed in the southern suburbs of Washington, and strictly controlled the idle people entering the city. Although Washington did not declare a state of martial law, in fact, Scott and others had already imposed stricter military control on Washington than Baltimore. This made Lincoln's presidential inauguration ceremony look more like a carefully planned military operation than a political ceremony. In the carriage, Seward reviewed Lincoln's inaugural speech, which he did not know how many times he had reviewed. Seward frowned and said to Lincoln, who was sitting opposite him, "Abraham, I agree that your inaugural speech is very convincing, but this speech seems too provocative. I am worried. Are you worried that Missouri and Kentucky will secede from the Union within a month after seeing the content of my inaugural speech? Or are you worried that the pseudo-government in the South will declare war on us after seeing this speech and march north, and we will have to fight a battle to defend Washington?" Lincoln said calmly. "I am worried about both," Seward said bluntly. "Whether you and I are worried or not, what is going to happen cannot be avoided by modifying the words of the inaugural speech," Lincoln said seriously. "Instead of sticking to cold butt and pinning illusory hopes on the attitudes of Southern and Western politicians, it is better to maximize the support of the Northern people." Under the escort of elite guards, the presidential motorcade arrived at the Capitol smoothly. Lincoln and Buchanan got off the carriage and entered the Capitol from the north. The 2 first attended the swearing-in ceremony of Vice President Hannibal Hamlin. After Hamlin was sworn in as the Vice President of the United States, it was the turn of Lincoln, the protagonist of today. It was a sunny day with a gentle breeze, although the temperature was a little low. The sky was clear and bright, and the morning breeze gently blew across the square in front of the federal Capitol. Everything seemed quiet and solemn. People gathered in the square early, looking forward to witnessing this ordinary man from Illinois become the leader of a great country. The scene was crowded. Due to the limited space in the square, those who did not get a seat in the square could only squeeze into the streets of Washington, D.C. to watch the ceremony. Although nothing could be seen on the street, the audience watching the ceremony on the street still felt very involved. On the main stage of the Capitol, Lincoln, dressed in a neat black suit, smiling but with a firm gaze, stood in front of the huge star-spangled banner. Beside him stood the former president and important government officials, as well as core members of the Republican and Democratic parties. Baker, an old friend of Lincoln and the host of the ceremony, introduced Lincoln to the dignitaries present. Lincoln wanted to stand up and take off his somewhat worn iconic beaver top hat, which was a gift from his employer when he was a legal counsel for the Atlantic Railroad. This was his first proper hat, and he always liked it very much. He always liked to wear it when attending important occasions and ceremonies, and today was no exception. But today, there seemed to be something wrong with the hat. I don't know if it was because the hat was too tight or because he was too nervous and excited. Lincoln's trembling hands could not successfully take off the hat. Douglas, the leader of the Northern Democratic Party standing next to Lincoln, saw Lincoln's dilemma and quickly said to Lincoln, "Mr. President, can I help you?" Lincoln bent down and lowered his head. Douglas stood on tiptoe to take off Lincoln's hat and kept it for Lincoln. Lincoln bowed deeply, strode with excitement, walked to the podium, and opened his powerful voice with a frontier accent, "All my fellow citizens of the United States. Today, we stand at a watershed in history. I can stand here not because of who I am, but because of who we are. You chose me. America is a strong and united country, and we are a nation with infinite possibilities. It has been 72 years since the first president took office under our Constitution. During this period, 15 very outstanding citizens have successively presided over the executive branch of the government. They have performed their duties in many difficulties and obstacles, and generally speaking, they have been successful. However, despite this precedent, I now take up this same office, which is only a short term of 4 years under the Constitution, under great and special difficulties. The division of the Union, which was only a threat before, has now become a terrible reality. Ambitious people with selfish interests have put this crazy behavior into action. In general law and constitutional terms, I hold that the Union of States is perpetual. Permanence is implicit, if not expressly provided, in the fundamental law of the government of the United States. We may safely say that no regular government has ever included in its constitution a provision for its own termination. The Union will continue in perpetuity, and cannot be destroyed, unless by some action not provided for in the Constitution itself. Again, if the United States is not a government in the true sense of the word, but a union of states in the nature of a contract, can it be indisputably annulled by a minority of the parties who have defaulted in it? One of the parties to a contract may default, or break it, but does not the consent of all the parties to it be required to legally annul it? Derived from these general principles, we hold that the proposition that the Union is perpetual, in legal terms, is confirmed by the history of the Union itself. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was, in fact, formed in 1774 by the Articles of Union. It was brought to maturity and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Union was brought to maturity by the Articles of Confederation of 1778, when the 13 states pledged themselves to the perpetuity of the Union, and finally, one of the declared purposes of the Constitution of 1787 was to build a more perfect Union, but if the Union could be dissolved by the laws of one or more states, then the Union would be less perfect than it was before the Constitution was established, because it would lose the important element of permanence. According to these views, no state could legally secede from the Union on its own initiative. All resolutions and decrees made to that end were legally invalid, and any violent separation by any state or states against the authority of the United States should be considered as rebellion or revolution, as the case may be. Therefore, I believe that the Union cannot be divided according to the Constitution and the laws. I will ensure that the laws of the Union are faithfully executed in the states according to the powers expressly granted to me by the Constitution itself. I consider this to be my only duty, and I will do it in a feasible way unless my legal master, the American people, does not give me the necessary means or authoritatively indicates the opposite. I believe that everyone will regard this as a threat, but only as the declared goal of the Union. It will defend and maintain itself according to the Constitution. In terms of physical geographical conditions, we cannot be separated. We cannot move the regions away from each other. Nor can we build an insurmountable wall between each other. Husbands and wives can divorce and no longer see each other or have no contact with each other, but the regions of our country cannot do that. No matter what happens, they still have to face each other, and they still have friendly or hostile intercourse with each other. Then, is it possible that the intercourse after separation will be more beneficial and more satisfactory than before separation? Is it easier for foreigners to make treaties than for friends to make laws? Is it more faithful for foreigners to enforce treaties than for friends to enforce laws? Suppose you make war, you cannot keep it up forever. When both sides have lost too much, and neither has gained anything, you will cease to fight, and then you will have the old questions of terms of intercourse. The president derives all his power from the people, but they have not given him the power to prescribe terms for the secession of the states. If the people so wish, they can do so, but as president, they cannot. His duty is to manage the government which has been given to him, and to hand it over intact to his successor. Why should we not have a firm faith in the supreme justice of the people? Is there anything better or as good in the world? In the differences I have had, did neither side lack the confidence that it was right? If the almighty ruler of the nations, with his eternal truth and justice, is on the side of the North, or the South, or the West, then that truth and that justice will prevail by the judgment of this great tribunal of the American people. These same Americans, by the present constitution of our government, have wisely given their servants but little power, so that they cannot do harm, and have equally wisely taken that little power back into their own hands at short intervals. No wickedness or folly, however great, could have done much harm to the government during the short 4 years of its office, so long as the people maintain their strength and vigilance. My fellow citizens, consider this whole subject calmly and seriously. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking it slow, and if there is a purpose which urges any of you to take a measure which you cannot be slow to act, that purpose will be frustrated by taking it slow. But no good purpose can be frustrated by taking it slow, and you who are now dissatisfied still have the old constitution intact, and, in sensitive matters, your own laws made under it. And the new administration has no direct power to change either of these conditions, even if it wishes to do so. Those who are dissatisfied, even if they are admitted to be on the right side of this controversy, have no justification for rash action. Reason, patriotism, Christianity, and faith in a God who has never forsaken this blessed land, can still solve all our present difficulties in the best way. Discontented fellow citizens, the key to the great question of civil war lies in your hands. If it is not in my hands, the government will not attack you. If you are not provocateurs, you will not face conflicts. I hereby take the most solemn oath, to unswervingly uphold, maintain and defend the Constitution of the United States. I am unwilling to end my speech. By this ceremony, I want to say to the American people of the South and the American people of the West, we are not enemies, but compatriots and friends. As compatriots and friends, why should we be enemies? Nothing can sever the emotional ties between us. The Union is indestructible and unbreakable, secession is illegal, and anyone who attempts to split the Union will be brought to justice. I will use the power granted to me by law to recover the lost federal public property and lands, and restore the right to set and collect import and export tariffs. Long live America! Long live the American people! Although Lincoln's speech was mixed with the accent of the frontier area, his pronunciation was very clear and his voice was very loud. The audience in front of the square could basically hear the content of Lincoln's inaugural speech. As Lincoln's inaugural speech ended, thunderous applause and cheers broke out at the scene. Although the audience in the back row did not hear clearly what Lincoln said, they still followed a trend and applauded and cheered. The crowd in the square waved the Star-Spangled Banner and shouted slogans such as "Long live President Lincoln," "Long live the United States of America," and "Long live the Union," to celebrate this historic moment. Lincoln stood on the podium for a long time. With a surging heart, he stared at the crowd surging like a tide. His eyes were firm and his faith was resolute. He had made up his mind to lead this broken country through the most difficult times. After Lincoln finished his speech, Chief Justice Roger Tyne, who was 84 years old and older than the United States of America, threw away his crutches, walked to Lincoln with a limp, and handed the inaugural declaration to the extremely tall 16th President of the United States. Lincoln bent down to take the inaugural declaration from the Chief Justice, and in front of the public, he placed his hand on the Bible and raised his right hand to swear, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and to the best of my ability, preserve, Protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. I just found out that Chapter 631 has been harmonized. It has been revised and submitted for review. Chapter 627 Land Act. What is the attitude of the French consul Liang Zhao? Fremont was eager to know the attitude of the French consul. Fremont's point of view was consistent with Liang Zhao, and he also believed that at this most difficult time, France was the key to the American Republic's breakthrough in the European continent. Liang Zhao's attitude was ambiguous and he did not make a clear statement. After the cabinet meeting, I will meet with the French consul alone. Liang Zhao signaled his assistant Zeiss to send an invitation letter to Liang Zhao. At least he is not as unreasonable as the British consul. Fremont breathed a sigh of relief and said, compared to diplomacy, domestic affairs are the focus of our next work. Liang Zhao turned to look at Minister of Agriculture Chen Baoliang and asked, Minister Chen, how is the draft of the Land Act of the American Republic? Liang Zhao's diplomatic attitude towards European countries is to strive for as much as possible. If European countries are unwilling to establish equal diplomatic relations with the West, he will never measure his own resources to win the favor of European countries. Europe is the center of the world in this era, but this world is not just Europe. Moreover, it is foolish to pin the hope of national survival on the interference and assistance of other countries. The key to the survival of the American Republic lies not on the outside, but in the support and recognition of its own citizens. The central hinterland of the North American continent, that is, the western frontier region in the mouth of the federal government, will inevitably be the focus of competition between the East and the West in the future. The population of the old industrial states in the Northeast, New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and even the core states of Ohio on the shores of Lake Erie, are almost saturated. Although the population of the 3 states on the west coast of the core area of the American Republic is not saturated, with the current immigration rate and population growth rate, it will take at most 1 generation for the population of the 3 states on the west coast to approach saturation. The American Republic, the United States of America, and even the Confederate States of America in the South. If you don't want to fall into a cruel stock game in the future, you must take over the frontier areas of the Midwest, strive for a broader living space for your people, and improve the quality of life of your people. Due to the consideration of factors such as political correctness, later generations often intentionally or unintentionally magnify the role of the Emancipation Proclamation when judging the success or failure of the Union and the Confederacy in the Civil War. In fact, the Homestead Act played a much greater role than the Emancipation Proclamation in enabling the Union to win the Civil War. The promulgation of the Homestead Act enabled the Lincoln government to gain users from the vast western frontier areas. Farmers in the western region reciprocated by supplying more than half of the soldiers to the Union Army and providing sufficient food security for the Union. Time waits for no one. If the government of the American Republic wants to firmly control the western and central frontier areas, it must issue and implement its own Land Act before the Lincoln government issues the Homestead Act, so as to win the support of the people in the frontier areas and minimize the war and agricultural potential of the federal government. This is the Land Act of the American Republic that I drafted. Please read it, Mr. President. Chen Baoliang submitted the Land Act that had already been drafted by the Ministry of Agriculture to Liang Zhao for review. Liang Zhao sat at his desk, carefully reviewing the Land Act of the American Republic and making revisions as appropriate. The final text of the revised Land Act of the American Republic is as follows. This act is enacted to support the workers of the country to reclaim wasteland and live and work in peace and contentment. Citizens who are 18 years of age or older, have never participated in treasonous activities, and support the government of the American Republic, regardless of race, gender, are eligible to apply for government land. The size of the land granted to patriotic citizens of the country depends on the actual situation in each place. Anyone who reclaims wasteland in California can register for a total area of no more than 250 acres, 41 acres, as a share after swearing that the land is obtained for the purpose of reclamation and paying a registration fee of $2. After the registrant has lived and cultivated on the homestead for 6 years, he or she can obtain a formal land license and become the owner of the homestead. The total area of land that can be registered for a share in Oregon is up to 400 acres, 66 acres, and a registration fee of $1 is required. The total area of land that can be registered for a share in Liang Zhao is up to 600 acres, 99 acres, and a registration fee of $1 is required. The total area of land that can be registered for a share in Utah, Colorado, Arizona and New Mexico is up to 800 acres, 132 acres, and no registration fee is required. The total area of land that can be registered for the state of West Mexico is up to 900 mu, 148 acres, and no registration fee is required. The total area of land that can be registered for the states and territories of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, etc. is up to 1,000 mu, 165 acres, and no registration fee is required. The legal property rights of all the lands in the above-mentioned areas are protected by the government of the Republic of America. No individual or organization may illegally deprive citizens of their land property rights. Violators will be punished according to the laws of their country. After the revision, Liang Zhao returned the text of the Land Act of the Republic of America to Chen Baolian and said, "Submit this bill to the Congress and make sure it is passed before February 15th. Yes, Mr. President." Chen Baolian respectfully took the Land Act of the Republic of America and checked the revised parts. In addition to raising the total area of land that can be registered, Liang Zhao also emphasized that regardless of race or gender, Chen Baolian could not help but admire, "Your Excellency the President is wise, stop flattering and do it immediately," Liang Zhao said. If this bill is to be implemented, the Ministry of Agriculture must set up a special registration department and hire staff. The operation of the registration department, the staff's food, clothing, and office supplies are all expensive expenses. The Ministry of Agriculture does not have that much funding at present. Chen Baolian hesitated for a moment, but still spoke. The meager registration fees collected by California, Oregon, and Liang Zhao are definitely not enough to carry out the registration work. Don't worry about the funds needed by the Ministry of Agriculture. Go back and write a registration work plan and submit it to the Ministry of Finance for review. After the Ministry of Finance reviews it, it will immediately approve the funds needed for the registration of the Ministry of Agriculture, Liang Zhao said to Chen Baolian. Do you have any objections? No, I'll do it right away, Chen Baolian replied. After convening the cabinet meeting, Liang Zhao and Connie took a carriage together and dragged their tired bodies back to Uxiuju. On the way, Connie pressed his twitching right eyelid and asked Liang Zhao, "According to you, which eyelid twitches for wealth and which eyelid twitches for disaster?" "The left eyelid twitches for wealth, and the right eyelid twitches for disaster," Liang Zhao said. "Oh no, my right eyelid has been twitching a lot since I left your office." "Is a disaster coming?" Connie said anxiously. "Have you done too many immoral things? Someone wants to do something to you," Liang Zhao teased. "Nonsense, I'm doing legitimate business, how can I be immoral?" Connie spat. Chapter 634 has been reviewed. Chapters are blocked one after another, cracked. Chapter 628, Unqualified Lobbyist. Back at Uxiuju, Liang Zhao and Connie barely got out of the car. Ding Lan, who had been waiting at the door, pulled Liang Zhao aside and said, "The father-in-law is here, and he doesn't look very good. Is it the one from the north or the one from the south?" Liang Zhao asked. "Is it my father?" Connie couldn't help but interrupt uneasily. "It's the one from New York," Ding Lan replied. "Vanderbilt is probably here as a lobbyist for Lincoln." Liang Zhao quickly guessed Vanderbilt's purpose. Hearing that his father was coming, Connie secretly complained, "No wonder my eyelids kept twitching on the way back." Connie said, "You two father-in-law and son-in-law, I won't accompany you anymore." Before Connie's foot stepped out of the threshold of the gate of Uxiuju, Vanderbilt appeared in front of him and said sarcastically, "Chairman Connie, after becoming the chairman of the Savings Committee, you don't even recognize me as your father." "How dare I, father?" Although Connie is over 30 years old and has achieved remarkable achievements in both politics and business, Connie still instinctively feels fear when facing Vanderbilt. "Father, you didn't tell me in advance when you came, so that I could greet you in advance," Liang Zhao said with a smile. "I dare not let the president of a country come to greet me," Vanderbilt said coldly. "You are modest. Before you left Washington, you were specially received by another president." Liang Zhao still kept a smile on his face. "What kind of talk are you two, father-in-law and son-in-law?" Standing at the door, Ding Lan interrupted. "If there is anything important, go to the inner courtyard and talk." Ding Lan asked the servant to close the door and led Vanderbilt and his son and Liang Zhao to the inner courtyard. "You understand, I won't beat around the bush. I am indeed entrusted by the President to hope that you can lead the 3 states on the West Coast back to the big family of the Federation, Vanderbilt said after sitting down. As an authentic New York industrial upstart, Vanderbilt is a loyal supporter of the federal government. In terms of political stance, Vanderbilt naturally stands on the side of the federal government. The president you are talking about is the president of the North, not our president, Liang Zhao asked Vanderbilt. Father, have you seen Lincoln's inaugural address? I was invited to attend President Lincoln's inauguration ceremony. I was there when His Excellency the President delivered his inaugural address, Vanderbilt said. Liang Zhao said to Vanderbilt, Lincoln said in his inaugural address that the Union was unbreakable and indestructible, and that secession was illegal and would be punished by law. But everything he did after winning the election pushed the country towards secession. Lincoln claimed that he would use his presidential power to recover the public land and property that originally belonged to the Union, and impose import and export tariffs on the so-called fallen areas. May I ask if these so-called fallen areas in Lincoln's mouth had not paid tariffs to the federal government on time before? May I ask why these so-called fallen areas are unwilling to pay tariffs to the federal government again? Is all this the fault of these so-called fallen areas? Are the tariff rates of the federal government set by these fallen areas? In addition, Lincoln repeatedly claimed that he would not take any bloody and violent means without endangering national sovereignty. Isn't their current behavior against the people of Baltimore bloody and violent enough? Lincoln had many successful speeches in his life, but his inaugural address was an exception and a relatively unsuccessful speech. There are many contradictions in it. Vanderbilt, with a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, remained silent. When he listened to Lincoln's inaugural speech, he also found something wrong with Lincoln's inaugural speech. However, at that time, almost all patriotic sentiments were induced and coerced by Lincoln, so he naturally did not dare to raise his questions. Lincoln has not had time to amend the Constitution yet. Liang Zhao finally gave Vanderbilt a fatal blow. Even according to the current Constitution of the federal government, we have the right to choose to secede from the Federation. Lincoln said that from the perspective of general law and the Constitution, he believed that the Federation composed of states is permanent. In the fundamental law of the United States government, even if permanence is not clearly stipulated, it is self-evident. After you go back, please be a messenger and tell Lincoln that the President's personal wishful will cannot represent a law. It is not us who violated the Constitution of the United States, but him and your entire North. The North is only a part of the Federation and cannot represent the entire Federation. Vanderbilt gave up persuading Liang Zhao. Vanderbilt knew that Liang Zhao represented the entire Western group. With his personal relationship with Liang Zhao, it was impossible to persuade Liang Zhao. At least he tried, and he had an explanation to Lincoln after he returned. Vanderbilt comforted himself in this way. After a long silence, Vanderbilt finally said, "You are so eloquent that I can't argue with you. Washington is serving in your army, and I hope to take him back to New York. Elizabeth is Liang Zhao's wife, and Connie follows Liang Zhao's lead and holds an important position in the American Republic." Vanderbilt knew that he could not take the 2 children with him. Vanderbilt could only settle for the second best, hoping to bring his most beloved youngest son Washington back to New York and back to his side. Washington is an adult, he has the right to decide his own life, and we have no right to decide his life, Liang Zhao said to Vanderbilt. Father, you have too strong a desire to control your children. Washington followed Liang Zhao to participate in actual combat, including the Second Fushoga War and the Second Mexican-American War. He fought bravely and was a capable general under Liang Zhao. Now Washington is the commander of the newly trained machine gun regiment. Liang Zhao naturally did not want to let this confidant and beloved general go. Vanderbilt was a successful businessman, but not a qualified father. Due to Vanderbilt's personality problems and desire for control, the conflicts between his 3 sons and Vanderbilt were quite sharp. Since Washington joined Liang Zhao's army, he has never returned to New York. This shows that Washington does not like his father and prefers to stay in the army. You are not qualified to tell me what to do. Vanderbilt got up angrily and left the table to find his grandson. Father is just like this. He is used to being strong. Don't take it to heart. After Vanderbilt left the table, Elizabeth said to Liang Zhao. I know, Liang Zhao said. The French consul has been waiting for a long time. You should go to see the French consul. I will deal with my father, Elizabeth said as she tidied up Liang Zhao's clothes. Liang Zhao nodded, walked through the courtyard and corridor, came to the reception room, and met with the French consul Ligoff. Sorry, Consul Ligoff, I have kept you waiting for a long time. Chapter 629, The Pattern Opens. It's an honor to see you again. Ligoff took off his hat and bowed to Liang Zhao. He did not call Liang Zhao the president or the governor. Please sit down. Liang Zhao made a gesture of invitation, motioning Ligoff to sit down. Have you conveyed to His Majesty Napoleon II the intention of our country to establish formal diplomatic relations with the French Empire? I have conveyed to His Majesty Napoleon II the intention of your country to establish diplomatic relations with France, Ligoff said after sitting down. This is a big matter. It's not that I deliberately delayed to whet your appetite, but such a big matter is not something that a small consul like me can decide. I personally hope that France can establish diplomatic relations with your country, which will also be of great benefit to my future. Then I wish you a promotion in advance. If the American Republic and the French Empire establish formal diplomatic relations, you are the only choice to be the ambassador to our country. At that time, I will definitely come to congratulate you in person. Liang Zhao raised his glass and clinked his glass with Ligoff, saying. Ligoff hesitated for a moment, but still took a sip of the red wine in the goblet, then licked his lips and said, Our country hopes that the Vietnamese authorities can open Da Nang and establish a mutually beneficial free trade relationship with us. However, the Vietnamese court misunderstood the good intentions of our French country, resulting in many disagreements between the two sides. The Vietnamese authorities have repeatedly requested the suzerain Qing dynasty to mediate on this matter. The Qing dynasty also sent a diplomatic note to pressure our country on this matter. I know that your uncle, Governor Liang, has a great influence in the Qing dynasty court. If you can convey our goodwill to Governor Liang, clarify the misunderstanding, and no longer obstruct and interfere in the opening of ports and trade between our country and Vietnam, I think this will be of great benefit to your country and our country. Sure enough, Sarawak alone cannot satisfy the appetite of the French Empire. The French authorities have long intended to interfere in the affairs of Southeast Asia, but the good places in Southeast Asia have basically been divided up by the two old colonial powers, Britain and the Netherlands. France can only look to the Indochina Peninsula and the vassal states of the Qing dynasty. It's a small matter, Liang Zhao shook his head and said, it's just that your country is narrow-minded. If Vietnam can be generous and sell a favor to France, this deal is still very cost-effective. Although Vietnam is small and poor, it is not a high-quality market, but mosquito meat is still meat. Ligoff was very surprised. He thought Liang Zhao would shirk responsibility, and the best result would be that he would shirk responsibility and then agree reluctantly. He didn't expect Liang Zhao's attitude to be so straightforward. Compared with his own shy attitude, Ligoff actually felt a little ashamed. Da Nang is too small. Not only Da Nang but also Saigon needs to be open for trade, Liang Zhao said. If the Nguyen court does not agree, I can let my uncle in Nagasaki lead the fleet and General Tromerin to persuade them to open the port. I see, you are a man of great vision, haha, Ligoff said happily. I will definitely convey your sincerity to His Majesty. Thank you very much, Liang Zhao smiled. I think there are many areas for our two countries to cooperate. The meeting with Ligoff had just ended when Presidential Secretary Xi sent a secret telegram that had just arrived. This secret telegram was sent by Chen Lissing in Kansas City. The content of the telegram was that Kansas Garrison Commander Longstreet would change the flag soon and hand over all the military forts and fortresses in Kansas to the hands of the Confederacy. Liang Zhao and Longstreet had met once. Longstreet was in charge of logistics during the Second Mexican-American War. Later, he was transferred to Kansas to take charge of Kansas to prevent the local civil war in Kansas from getting out of control. Longstreet is from Edford County, North Carolina. He lives in the South and has a hometown sentiment for the South. Most of his troops are from the South. It is reasonable for Longstreet to embrace the South. After several reinforcements, the federal government has more than 3,000 troops stationed in major military forts in Kansas. Although more than 3,000 people are not many, you have to know that neither the North nor the South has officially started to mobilize for conscription. The federal government has only more than 17,000 standing troops on paper, and most of these standing troops are scattered near the Indian boundary in the border areas. This is why most of the troops transferred to Baltimore by the federal government's War Department are militias, and there are few regular troops. The federal government does not have many mobile regular troops that can be mobilized. Longstreet led his troops to the south, which means that the more than 17,000 standing troops that the federal government can directly control will be reduced to more than 14,000. This is undoubtedly great news for Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao continued to read the second half of the secret telegram. The content of the second half was that Lieutenant Colonel Cullen under Longstreet was an abolitionist and did not want to follow Longstreet to pledge allegiance to the Confederacy. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Cullen did not want to be an enemy of his old boss Longstreet. It is possible to strive to let Lieutenant Colonel Cullen lead his troops to the west. Chen Listen asked Liang Zhao in the call whether to continue to contact Lieutenant Colonel Cullen and win him over. Liang Zhao hurried back to his office and found the defense map of Kansas. He was previously a major senior general of the federal government. He had the main garrison maps of the Federal Army in various places. Soon, Liang Zhao found Cullen Station. Cullen led 6 companies to station at Fort Manhattan, west of Kansas City. The location of Fort Manhattan is extremely critical. If Liang Zhao can control Fort Manhattan, Mason's Federal Army stationed at Fort Kearny will face the dilemma of being attacked from both sides by the North Platte Fort Group and Fort Manhattan. At the same time, the Manhattan Fort stood on the Kansas Plains. As long as it was not surrounded, it could threaten the logistics supply route of Mason's Federal Army at any time. Liang Zhao was overjoyed and ordered Chen Listen, Kruger and Lieutenant Colonel Cullen, who were in charge of North Platte, to contact Cullen and make sure to win him over. The news that the 3 states on the West Coast jointly accused the Lincoln government of violating the Constitution, question election fraud, and announced the establishment of the Republic of America quickly spread throughout North America through the developed telegraph network. The Richmond authorities were ecstatic when they learned of the news. If the West entered the field to disrupt the situation, it meant that the Northern Federation would face military threats from the South and the West at the same time. This would greatly weaken the threat of the Northern Federation to the Southern Confederacy and would be a major benefit to the Southern Confederacy. Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, expressed support for the just act of the 3 states on the West Coast to defend the Constitution and immediately recognized the Republic of America. On February 20, 1861, the Texas authorities officially announced their withdrawal from the Union, established the Republic of Texas, and established diplomatic relations with the Confederate States of America and the Republic of America at the speed of light. At this point, except for Kentucky and Missouri, which are still wavering and have not yet decided on their allegiance, the camps of the remaining states have been made clear. Chapter 630, Comparison of Strength. There is no doubt that the strength of the North in multiple dimensions was much stronger than that of the South and the West. In terms of population, by the end of February 1861, the North had a total population of more than 23 million, the South had a total population of 10.5 million, and the effective population that the Western regime could control was about 5.2 million, including 1.3 million Mexicans. At first glance, it seems that the population gap between the Southern Confederacy and the North is not very large. However, since the South practiced slavery, more than 4.5 million of the 10.5 million people were black slaves and slaves from Southeast Asia and Japan. The free people in the South, that is, the population that can be mobilized and transformed into war potential, are only 6 million, which is only slightly higher than the West, and only a little more than a quarter of the total population of the North. In terms of industrial output value, the North has a large-scale industry with an annual industrial output value of up to $1.73 billion. After 2 5-year plans, the West has also initially established a relatively complete and self-sufficient industrial system, but in terms of industrial volume, it is still not comparable to the North. The industrial output value of the West is $550 million. The industrial output value of the South was $250 million, not even half of that of the West, not to mention the North. The industrial output value of New York State alone in the North has exceeded that of the South. Industrial cities are everywhere in the North, including developed industrial cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and countless small and medium-sized industrial cities. The West also has 3 industrial cities, Jinshan, Los Angeles, and Sacramento, as well as small and medium-sized industrial cities such as Portland, Liang Zhao, and San Diego. The only cities in the South that can be called industrial cities are Richmond, Houston, and Austin. Compared with the industrial cities in the North and the West, Richmond, Houston, and Austin can only be regarded as medium-sized cities at best. As for New Orleans, the largest city in the South at this time, it is not an industrial city, but only a commercial city. In terms of manufacturing facilities, including factories and small handicraft workshops, the North has 118,000 manufacturing facilities, the West has 33,000 industrial facilities, and the South has only 21,000 industrial manufacturing facilities. Many of these in the South rely on technology and professional workers from the North or the West to operate normally. If the North and the West are completely cut off, it would be a blessing if a quarter of the 21,000 industrial facilities in the South can remain in normal operation. In terms of industrial workers, the North has 1.42 million industrial workers, the West has 380,000 industrial workers, and the South has only 180,000 industrial workers. In terms of steel production, the annual steel production in the North in 1860 was 1.36 million tons, of which the annual steel production in Pennsylvania alone was as high as 600,000 tons. The annual steel production in the West was 430,000 tons, and the figure in the South was less than 50,000 tons, not even a fraction of Pittsburgh, the steel capital of the North. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, has a steel production of 270,000 tons. In terms of railway mileage, the railway mileage in the North is more than 25,000 miles, in the South it is 11,000 miles, and in the West it is 7,600 miles. In terms of urbanization rate, the urbanization rate in the North is 35%, in the South it is 8%, and in the West it is 44%. Even in the agricultural field that the South is proud of, the South is not as good as the North. Of course, the agricultural output value of the South is still much higher than that of the West. After all, the South grows high-value cash crops. The number of farms in the South is only half of that in the North, and the agricultural output value is less than half of that in the North. In terms of crop types, the North mainly grows food crops such as wheat, vegetables, and fruits. The South grows cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar, and the West grows everything. Because cash crops have occupied a large amount of agricultural land in the South, although the South claims to have developed agriculture, it cannot even be self-sufficient in food and bread freedom, and needs to export cash crops in exchange for wheat. In this regard, the South is not even as good as the West, which has achieved food self-sufficiency at least 4 or 5 years ago. In terms of the Navy, the Northern Federal Government Navy has more than 8,000 people and more than 90 ships of various sizes, including nearly 40 cutting-edge steam warships. The South's naval power is approximately equal to zero, and only the Republic of Texas has a relatively high-quality green water fleet. The above data also includes the data of the Republic of Texas in the South. If Texas is excluded, the data of the Confederacy will only be uglier. Of course, compared with the North, the South and the West are not without any advantages. Among the top leaders of the three parties, Davis, the top leader of the South, and Liang Zhao, the top leader of the West, have a stronger military background than Lincoln, the top leader of the North. Davis, the top leader of the South, graduated from the West Point Military Academy, served in the regular army, participated in the Mexican-American War, and was promoted to brigadier general. During the Mexican-American War, Davis commanded the army and even served as the Secretary of War of the United States. Davis is friends with many generals and has great prestige in the army. Liang Zhao, the top leader of the West, was also promoted to brigadier general before leading the 3 states on the West Coast to withdraw from the Federation. The Buchanan government also had the idea of promoting Liang Zhao to lieutenant general. This is recognized by the federal government. Although the federal government issued a statement that it did not recognize Liang Zhao's rank of general, it still recognized Liang Zhao's rank of brigadier general. Liang Zhao led his army to participate in wars in the Far East and Southeast Asia, as well as the Second Mexican-American War and some local civil wars. He is the general with the most practical experience in the American military in recent years. Lincoln, the supreme leader of the Northern Federation, had a poor record in the army. Lincoln served in the Illinois militia, the so-called strawfoot troops. He had no experience in serving in regular troops, and had never served as a middle or senior officer to command a battle. Although Lincoln also participated in actual combat, it was against the Indians. Compared with the brilliant military resumes of Liang Zhao and Davis, the military achievements Lincoln made during his service were obviously not up to par. Although Lincoln won the wrestling championship, it was just a brave man. Moreover, in terms of personal bravery, Davidson and Liang Zhao were not inferior. Lincoln was a politician and orator, but not a military strategist. This was the general view of all walks of life at this time. In addition, although the North had an overwhelming advantage in military and war potential compared to the South and the West, in terms of preparation for war, it was obvious that the South and the West were more fully prepared. America's important arsenals, military fortresses, and many naval bases are located in the South. After announcing their withdrawal from the Union, the Southern states quickly took control of these military facilities. By the end of February 1861, there were only a few military facilities in the South controlled by the federal government. It is estimated that after controlling these military facilities, the South obtained more than 250,000 rifles, more than 500 large and small artillery pieces, and countless military items such as gunpowder and detonators. The federal government's War Department roughly estimated that the military facilities and related military supplies occupied by the South were worth more than $35 million. Including the weapons inventory that the South already had, the South now had more than 430,000 standard rifles, nearly 1,000 artillery pieces, and relatively sufficient ammunition. Backed by a sufficient arsenal, the South had enough weapons to arm a powerful armed force in the early stages of the war and enough ammunition to fight several large battles. In fact, the South did the same. During the 1860 election, many knowledgeable people in the South had already predicted that Republican Lincoln would win the election, and military organizations across the South sprang up like mushrooms after rain, with the support of local gentry. By the end of February 1861, the South had assembled a volunteer army of about 100,000 people. South Carolina has been providing military training to all men of military age since 1848. It can be said that all men in the state are soldiers. At this time, the North had organized no more than 50,000 military personnel, of which only more than 17,000 were regular soldiers. At this time, the Southern Army was not only larger in number than the Northern Army, but also better in quality. The South has always been known for its tough foe customs, and most of the Southern soldiers have participated in the two Mexican-American Wars, and their actual combat experience is much richer than that of the Northern Army. Although the South's industrial strength is weak, since 1850, the South has attached great importance to the military industry and has tilted a lot of resources to the military industry. The Richmond arsenal can produce more than 70,000 guns of all kinds annually if the raw materials are sufficient and the production is full of power. The Austin arsenal can produce more than 35,000 rifles annually. These two military factories can basically maintain the current demand for light weapons by the Southern Army. Although the steel output of Richmond's Tredegar Steel Plant and Austin Steel Plant cannot be compared with that of the large steel plants in Pittsburgh and Gold Mountain. The steel produced by the plant is of high quality and can be used to make weapons. In addition, both the Richmond Arsenal and the Austin Arsenal have the ability to produce heavy artillery, but the technology for producing heavy artillery at the Richmond Arsenal comes from the North, while the technology for producing heavy artillery at the Austin Arsenal comes from the West. The so-called claim that the South cannot produce guns, artillery and bullets is a fallacy. It is not that the South does not have any industry, but that the industrial capacity and potential of the South are far inferior to those of the North. If the South really cannot produce even a gun or a cannon, how can it arm a million-strong army? How can it fight a 4-year battle with an industrial country in the North? It is a bit too shocking that an industrial country with a population of more than 20 million cannot defeat an agricultural country with only 6 million freemen in 4 years. It is true that the South is an agricultural country, but it is not a classical agricultural country in the full sense. It still has a small amount of industrial economy, but the industrial economy of the South is in a weak position in the economic structure. As for the shortage of military supplies in the South, it was indeed a common phenomenon after the South was completely blocked by the North from both land and sea in the middle and late stages of the war. But in the early stages of the war, thanks to the military supplies stockpiled before the war in the occupied federal arsenal, the supplies in the South were relatively sufficient. As for the West, there are nearly 28,000 regular troops in the West that can be put into combat at any time, and the younger generation of militia in the West is also very sufficient. The West prepared for war earlier than the South, and a considerable number of militias have been trained in the West over the years. Although the West is not as good as the North and the South in terms of the number of troops that can be mobilized. However, the West has the natural dangers of the Rocky Mountains and the Cordillera Mountains, which are better than 100,000 soldiers. As long as the West does not take the initiative to advance eastward on a large scale to capture cities and territories, these troops are not aggressive enough for the West, but they are more than enough to protect themselves. In terms of military industry, the output of weapons in the West is higher than that in the South, and the quality is better than that in the North. Weapons produced in the West are synonymous with high-end goods in America, not to mention that the West has General Liang Zhao 1857 rifle and Sacramento cannon, which are advanced goods coveted by the entire U.S. Army. Even the same Colt pistol, due to the strict management of the Sacramento arsenal, more advanced equipment, higher quality and enthusiasm of the workers, the Colt pistols produced by the Sacramento arsenal are of better quality than the original Colt pistols, and are more popular in the market. At present, the Sacramento arsenal can produce 320 long and short guns per day, and about 40 Sacramento cannons per month under normal circumstances. Moreover, compared with the South, the raw material channels in the West are more reliable, and most of the raw materials can be obtained locally. In the Western Armory, there are more than 100,000 rifles in reserve, 1,300 machine guns in reserve, and 840 cannons in reserve. Unlike the armory in the South, the guns and cannons stored in the armory in the West are mostly advanced General Liang and 1857 rifles and Sacramento cannons. The worst weapons are also 23,500 retired and sealed Walter M1851 rifles. The Walter M1851 rifle is only equipped by a small number of elite troops in the Southern Army and the Northern Army. Therefore, in terms of equipment quality, the Western Army has a great advantage over the Southern Army and the Northern Army, which to a certain extent makes up for the disadvantage of the relatively insufficient military strength in the West. In terms of generals, the quality of Western and Southern generals is better than that of the Northern Army. There are famous generals such as Liang Zhao, Kruger, and Elvis in the West, and Davis, Robert Lee, Longstreet, two Johnstons, two Hills, Jackson, Beauregard and other famous generals in the South. At this time, most of the senior generals in the North were concurrently held by politicians in the North, so the military literacy of the senior generals in the North was relatively low. The most capable general in the North was Lieutenant General Scott, and the rest were mostly mediocre. However, Scott was already over 70 years old, and it was obviously impossible for him to personally command a battle on the front line like the young and powerful generals in the South and the West. In addition, the South also had the trump card of cotton. Cotton was the confidence of the Southerners. The South supplied more than two-thirds of the world's industrial cotton and was the most important raw material warehouse for European textile factories. The South was sure that holding the trump card of cotton would bring them great diplomatic advantages, in order not to lose the South, a source of high-quality and low-cost raw materials. European countries, especially Britain and France, which had developed cotton textile industries, would definitely stand firmly on the side of the Confederate States of America. The cotton of the South was white gold, and no cotton-producing area in the world could replace the status of the South. This was the idea of most Southerners, including the elites and civilians in the South. The West also had petrochemical products, especially kerosene, a unique trade product, but the Western authorities did not emphasize the role and status of kerosene as much as the South emphasized the importance of cotton. The Southerners placed their greatest hope of victory on white and soft cotton, while the Westerners did not place their hopes on a single trade item. Chapter 631 Misfortunes never come singly. Even though the federal government had so many advantages on paper and had many cards to play, the Northern Democratic Party also recognized the Republican Party's rule and Lincoln's legitimacy as president. Lincoln, who had just taken office as president, had a lot of troubles. Although the federal government completely controlled Baltimore, the entire state of Maryland, and the entire state of Delaware, ensuring the safety of the area north of Washington, Lincoln did not have to fight a battle to defend the capital as soon as he took office. However, the unpleasant things that happened in Baltimore greatly damaged the image of the federal government, causing the federal government to lose the support of some southern swing states, causing these southern swing states to completely fall into the arms of the Confederacy. On March 2, 1861, a piece of news came from the Kansas Territory that was as bad as it could be for the federal government. General Longstreet, who was in charge of the defense of the Kansas Territory, publicly announced a change of flag, and handed over most of the military facilities in the Kansas Territory and more than 2,000 elite soldiers who were good at fighting to the hands of the Confederacy intact. All the stars and stripes flying over Kansas were lowered and replaced by the stars and stripes representing the Confederacy. Thank God, at least Lieutenant Colonel Cullen is still loyal to the Union. We still control Fort Manhattan, and northwestern Kansas still belongs to the federal government. Secretary of War Scott looked at the list of Nantow officers and the numbers of the Nantow troops on the telegram, and saw that Lieutenant Colonel Cullen and his troops did not throw themselves into the arms of the Confederacy, and said with relief, "This is a good news among the few bad news." Because the North lacks prestigious and capable senior generals, Lincoln looked around and did not find a candidate suitable for the position of Secretary of War. The North is really lacking in generals and commanders, so Lincoln decided to let Scott stay in the cabinet as Secretary of War. Although this is considered a veteran of the North and the oldest general in the United States, his hometown is also in Virginia, a state of outstanding people and beautiful scenery. But Lincoln had no choice. Lincoln did not have a deep intersection with the military, and his social circle had few friends in the military, and no one was qualified for the position of Secretary of War. This is indeed good news. Lincoln planned to send a telegram to commend Lieutenant Colonel Cullen, a loyal officer of the Union. Unexpectedly, the next day, March 3, 1861, Lieutenant Colonel Cullen declared his allegiance to the government of the American Republic in the West and accepted the colonel appointment of Liang Zhao, the President of the American Republic. Cullen's troops were also reorganized into the Kansas Regiment of the Republic's National Defense Army. So far, the federal government has completely lost control of Kansas. Most of Kansas became the territory of the Southern Confederacy, and a corner of northwest Kansas centered on Fort Manhattan was incorporated into the territory of the Western American Republic. Shortly after receiving the news of Cullen's rebellion in the West, Lincoln and his cabinet received a letter of assistance from Colonel Mason stationed in Kearney. Colonel Mason pleaded with the War Department to send at least 2 or 3 regiments of troops to the Kearney area, preferably with an artillery regiment. Cullen's rebellion meant that Mason's Kearney fort had been caught in a situation of being attacked from both sides by the Western Army, and the Kearney fort, which was used to contain the North Platte Western Army from going east, was already in danger. Colonel Mason's concerns were understandable. Increase troops? Lincoln and Scott also wanted to increase troops in the Kearney area. The federal government did not have many standing troops and volunteers. The Kansas garrison went to the south, and the federal government's 17,000 regular troops dropped sharply to 14,000, and this number was still decreasing. More and more officers and soldiers in the Federal Army crossed the border to join the Southern Army. To make matters worse, these standing troops were scattered in the frontier areas to suppress the Plains Indians, and the mobile forces that could be withdrawn were extremely limited. Faced with such a difficult situation, Lincoln even came up with the idea of setting up a militia bureau under the War Department without the authorization of Congress to quickly mobilize and recruit a large number of troops to alleviate the plight of insufficient federal troops. Good fortune never comes alone, and misfortune never comes alone. Just when Lincoln was troubled by the lack of defense in the western frontier, he received a report from Lieutenant Colonel Robert Anderson of Fort Sumter. In this extremely urgent report, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson mentioned that the military supplies of Fort Sumter could only support 3 months. If he could not obtain sufficient supplies and reinforcements in time, he would be forced to surrender to the Confederate Army in South Carolina. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson also emphasized in the report that at least 25,000 well-trained soldiers must be available to ensure that Fort Sumter is safe, otherwise the fall of Fort Sumter is only a matter of time. Lincoln wanted to curse after reading Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's report. If Colonel Mason's request for the federal government to send 2 or 3 standing regiments to Fort Kearney was reasonable, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's request was simply nonsense and an excuse for surrender 25,000 well-trained soldiers. Damn, the standing army and volunteer army that the federal government can command now do not have this number. Lincoln's cabinet members debated the urgent issue of whether to hold on to Fort Sumter or abandon Fort Sumter. Secretary of State Seward's view was to abandon Fort Sumter. The reason Seward gave was that Fort Sumter was not fully completed, the fort was not very strong, the number of cannons on the fort was not large, and the ammunition was not sufficient. In addition, Fort Sumter was far away from the north, and the supply of Fort Sumter would impose a huge financial burden on the already tight federal government. Moreover, they could not meet the 25,000 reinforcements requested by Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. Postmaster General Blair also said that if there really had 25,000 elite mobile troops, why not directly attack Richmond, the capital of the Southern puppet government, 100 miles away, instead of wasting precious troops on an unfinished fortress 700 miles away from Washington? Could it be that the strategic and political significance of the southern industrial center and the capital of the puppet government was not as great as that of a fortress at the mouth of Charleston? Secretary of War Scott advocated sticking to Fort Sumter. Scott believed that Fort Sumter controlled the outlet to Charleston, the largest coastal city in South Carolina and the second largest city. Even from a purely military perspective, Fort Sumter was of great significance. As long as Fort Sumter was controlled, the most important port in South Carolina and the outlet to the sea for coastal cities could be turned into an inland city. It would prevent South Carolina's cash crops such as cotton, sugar, and tobacco from going out to sea from the port of Charleston, which would then severely damage South Carolina's economy. South Carolina was the most hardline slave state in the South. If a military fortress could paralyze South Carolina's economy, it would be very worthwhile. At the same time, Scott also refuted Blair's views, saying that Blair did not understand military affairs at all, was confusing people, and was stealing concepts. Attacking Richmond, the capital of the Southern pseudo-government, and supporting Fort Sumter were two completely different things and there was no comparison. Finally, Scott did not forget to mock Blair for having attended West Point Military Academy, but being so short-sighted, which was a shame to West Point Military Academy. Chapter 632, Fort Sumter Crisis. Lincoln himself was more inclined to stick to Fort Sumter. He considered the significance of Fort Sumter to the North from a political perspective. Since the results of the presidential election came out last year, military facilities in the South have fallen into the hands of Southern states one after another. Fort Sumter is currently the only fortress in the South that is still under the control of the federal government and has great military significance. This fortress has great political value for the federal government, especially since it is located in South Carolina, where anti-Northern sentiment has always been the highest. Moreover, the North also needs Fort Sumter to boost the morale of the Northern military and civilians. In short, Fort Sumter is more of an integrity issue than a military issue. If Fort Sumter is abandoned without a shot being fired, it is undoubtedly a proactive show of weakness to the South. This will not only give the South an illusion that the North is weak and can be bullied, but Lincoln, as president, himself has no way to explain to the people of the North. At this time, the Northern Yankees did not have the courage to defend the so-called federal government, and the cowardly Northern Yankees did not dare to face the brave Southerners. Such remarks were rampant in the South. Timely support for Fort Sumter can not only show the fearless attitude of the Northerners to the South and the determination of the North to maintain the integrity of the country, but also make the rumors widely circulated in the South self-defeating. Fort Sumter must be defended. We can't give up Fort Sumter. After careful consideration, Lincoln set the tone for this matter and expressed his attitude to the cabinet members. But it cannot be defended according to Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's method, and Fort Sumter cannot accommodate more than 20,000 troops. If you have any good ideas, please speak freely. Fort Sumter must be supported, but it cannot be supported according to Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's method. Lincoln asked his cabinet members for advice. Lincoln also knew that Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's request for 25,000 reinforcements was nothing more than a bargaining with the federal government and a way for himself. It is a very difficult task to reinforce Fort Sumter. The South Carolinians have already set up cannons along the coast of Fort Sumter, Blair said worriedly. This may also be a trap set by the Southerners. They will use Fort Sumter as bait to attack the reinforcements. We certainly have the ability to support Sumter, there is no doubt about that. But doing so may directly trigger a full-scale civil war in advance. Seward was also very worried, but the problem that Seward was most worried about was not the gains and losses of a fort or a fort, but the consequences that would be brought to the North after supporting Fort Sumter. We and the people of the North are ready for war, but our finances are not ready. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase reminded Lincoln and the cabinet members present not to be swayed by emotions and make decisions carefully. Compared with the South and the West, the North was quite unprepared for the war. The North's inadequate preparation for the war was reflected in all aspects. In addition to the inadequate military preparation, the North had no financial preparation. Previously, the South and the West contributed more than two-thirds of the federal government's tariff revenue, which was the two most important sources of revenue for the federal government. Therefore, after the South and the West withdrew from the Union, the South and the West had an additional tariff revenue, and their financial situation was getting better and better. After losing the tariff revenue from cotton in the South and petrochemical products in the West, the federal government's tariff revenue was only 1/3 of what it was before. These revenues were barely enough to maintain the normal operation of the federal government, not to mention launching a full-scale war. Although the industry in the North was large and relatively developed, the factory owners in the North were never the big taxpayers of the federal government, but the beneficiaries of the federal government's high tariff policy. "I will find a way to open up new tax sources for fiscal issues," Lincoln said. Mr. President, opening up new tax sources is a very sensitive issue. If we are not careful, it may cause our government to fall into turmoil. Chase reminded that if he wanted to open up new tax sources, he could only take action against the factory owners in the North. These people were not only the beneficiaries of the government's high tariff policy, but also the most important ruling foundation of their Republican Party. "I know that, too." Lincoln's tone revealed a bit of helplessness, but he still said firmly, "Rights and obligations are equal. There is no such thing as enjoying rights without fulfilling obligations. Can we still count on the tariffs created by Southern cotton and Western petrochemical products to defend our United States?" The fiscal problem of the federal government is Lincoln's biggest headache at the moment. Lincoln is more worried about the fiscal problem of the federal government than the military threats from the South and the West. The destructive power caused by internal crises is far greater than external threats. Lincoln shifted the topic back to the Fort Sumter crisis. He said, "Fort Sumter must be supported, but not on the way proposed by Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. We cannot send an elite force of 25,000 people to South Carolina. Do you have any good ideas?" "There are ways," Blair thought for a while and said. "We can use empty tugboats to transport materials to Fort Sumter under the cover of night. My wife's relative, Captain Fox, who served in the Navy before, once proposed to the War Department during the Buchanan administration to use tugboats to transport construction materials to Fort Sumter at night. However, because Captain Fox was of low rank and his words were not taken seriously, the then Secretary of War did not adopt Captain Fox's suggestion. If this suggestion had been adopted at the time, Fort Sumter would have been completed long ago and become a solid fortress with sufficient supplies." As he spoke, Blair looked at Scott intriguingly. The then Secretary of War he was referring to was Scott. Yes, Fort Sumter, a sea fortress that had been under construction since 1827, was not completed by 1861, and the progress of the project was less than 90%. The failure of Fort Sumter to be completed was certainly due to the difficulty of building a large military fortress at sea, but the obstruction of the South Carolina authorities was the most important factor affecting the progress of the project. The federal government at the time built Fort Sumter in the name of protecting the Charleston waterway, but as the relationship between the North and the South deteriorated, the South Carolina authorities realized that the sea fortress under construction would threaten the Charleston waterway, so they began to interfere with the construction of Fort Sumter. The South Carolina government not only stopped the delivery of construction materials to Sumter, but also explicitly prohibited local workers from participating in the construction of the project. Therefore, the sea fortress, which was built in 1829, has not been fully completed yet, and the weapons on the fortress are also uneven. Scott had no choice but to accept the suggestion of Captain Gustavus Vassar Fox. But this was Buchanan's intention. Buchanan did not want to vent his anger on the South because of a small fortress, so he shelved Fox's proposal, so that during his tenure, the progress of Fort Sumter's construction was delayed. "Okay, recall Major Fox and let Major Fox submit a practical action report to me immediately." Lincoln had already smelled the gunpowder in the conversation and made a decision. He had just thought about this plan carefully. The South had no decent navy except Texas. The federal government's navy had an absolute advantage and controlled the sea. Although the Southern artillery is scattered along the coast of Fort Sumter, the accuracy of these artillery shots at night is not ideal. As long as enough supplies can be delivered to Fort Sumter, with the cooperation of the Navy, 2,500 people instead of 25,000 can maintain control of this sea fortress for a long time. The cost of this action is acceptable to Lincoln and is within the reach of the federal government at this stage. Of course, the premise of all this is that the cowardly Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, who surrendered before the battle, can defend Fort Sumter before obtaining external support. Lincoln had already conceived the idea of changing the commander of Fort Sumter at this time, but he just didn't say it. Chapter 633 At All Costs. 1861, After most of the territories in the western regions, including Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and West Mexico, had completed preparations for statehood, representatives from each region submitted applications for statehood to the Congress of the American Republic. The Congress of the American Republic quickly approved the applications for statehood from these western territories. Within a week, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and West Mexico became states and joined the big family of the American Republic. The white star flag symbolizing the American Republic was planted in most of the western regions. The three territories that still belonged to the federal government in name, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, were too far away from the core areas of the Federation, and the federal government could not effectively control these three remote territories. The American Republic, which had the advantage of geographical location, began to gradually encroach on these sparsely populated territories by virtue of its geographical advantages. With the addition of new states, the states of the American Republic have rapidly expanded from 3 to 8, and the actual controlled territory is comparable to that of the Northern Federation and the Southern Confederacy. The only drawback is that except for the 3 states on the West Coast and the state of West Mexico, the land quality of the remaining states of the Republic is relatively low, and the population carrying capacity is not very high. Compared with the federal government, the difficulties faced by the government of the Republic mainly come from diplomacy. As of mid-March, there are only 5 countries that officially recognize the American Republic. These 5 countries are the Confederate States of America, the Republic of Texas, the Kingdom of Hawaii, Japan, and Mexico, the southern neighbor of the Republic. Among them, Mexico has also proposed to remove Spanish from the official language before considering establishing diplomatic relations with the American Republic. The American Republic naturally ignored Mexico's unreasonable demands and issued a statement that which language is positioned as one of the official languages of the Republic is the internal affairs of the American Republic, and no country has the right to interfere. After issuing the statement, the government of the American Republic mobilized the Mexican Brigade, a militia force in the state of West Mexico, to conduct live-fire military exercises in the U.S.-Mexico border area. The Atlantic Fleet in the port of Veracruz also fired a cannon to demonstrate to the Mexican government. Another northern neighbor of Mexico, the Republic of Texas, also put pressure on Mexico in the northeastern border area, demanding that Mexico recognize the legal status of the Republic of Texas and establish formal diplomatic relations. The Confederate States of America also made the same request. Upon hearing the news, the federal government quickly issued diplomatic threats to the Mexican authorities, threatening Mexico not to establish diplomatic relations with an illegal government that was not recognized by the international community, otherwise it would bear the consequences. These actions frightened the Mexican high-level officials in Mexico City. After weighing the pros and cons, the Mexican government agreed to unconditionally establish diplomatic relations with the American Republic, the Confederate States of America, and the Republic of Texas, and recognized the legal status of the 3 countries. The Mexican high-level officials desperately realized that even if the original United States of America was split into 4 pieces, it was not something that a country like him could control. At the same time, in order to resolve the Fort Sumter crisis, Lincoln adopted Major Fox's proposal, requisitioned some tugboats in New York and loaded them with military supplies needed for Fort Sumter. It sailed south in a mighty manner. The mobilized 55th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, organized by the French commander Baron Philippe Regis de Trobriand, followed closely and boarded the transport ship to Fort Sumter. The regiment is a national regiment with a strong national character. The soldiers of the regiment are mainly composed of experienced French immigrants and fake French immigrants. The officers and soldiers of the 55th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment wore dark blue double-breasted coats and red trousers that were almost exactly the same as those of the French Army. From a distance, they looked like the French Army. In the American military system, volunteers and militia are both reserve forces. But the difference between the two is greater than the difference between the Green Camp soldiers of the Jiangnan and Jiangbei camps and the Guangdong Yuan of the Governor's Standard Camp of the Yangzhou Governor's Office. The American militia, also known as the straw feet, is composed of the lower-class people who have only received the most basic military skills training. The volunteers were mainly composed of retired soldiers and officers with military experience, as well as mercenaries from other countries. The combat effectiveness of the volunteer corps was not inferior to that of the regular corps, and in many cases, it was even more capable than the regular corps. The federal government sent such an elite volunteer corps with heavy weapons to rescue Fort Sumter in the face of a serious shortage of troops, which shows how much the federal government attaches importance to Fort Sumter. The federal government dispatched troops to Fort Sumter, while sending a signal of peaceful dialogue to Richmond, indicating that the existence of slavery was only an internal dispute between different parties in the United States, and the federal government welcomed the brothers in the South to return to the federal family at any time. Although Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, was a soldier, he was not ignorant of politics, let alone a fool. Davis, who had a deep understanding of the current situation, knew very well that this was just a delaying tactic taken by the federal government to delay time. The South had long lost the basis of trust for dialogue, which he knew, and Lincoln knew even better. But facing the Northern fleet that set out from New York and sailed across the coast of Virginia, Davis felt helpless. Davis had mixed feelings. He had a strong army, but he didn't have a decent fleet. He couldn't stop the Northern fleet from rushing south to rescue Fort Sumter in South Carolina. It's hateful, hateful. We don't even have a few decent warships. If I had a warship as powerful as the West, I would have to send these swaggering Northerners to the sea to feed the fish, on Virginia Beach. Davis sighed as he looked at the Northern warships and civilian ships flying the stars and stripes and swaggering south. The West has established formal diplomatic relations with us, and their relationship with us is also friendly. Our finances are also relatively abundant. We can buy cutting-edge steam warships from the West. Robert Lee followed Davidson and suggested to Davis. Although the West and the North have their own official names, Robert Lee is more accustomed to calling the United States of America the North and the Republic of America the West. Robert Lee was confused about the future of the Confederate States of America. Lincoln and Scott had sent letters to Robert Lee, promising him wealth and honor, hoping that this outstanding Southern general who did not support slavery could take office in the federal government. Robert Lee did not like slavery, but he loved his hometown Virginia. The actions of the Lincoln government after it came to power, which blatantly violated the Constitution and trampled on state rights, also made Robert Lee disgusted with the Lincoln government. After weighing the pros and cons, Robert Lee finally decided to be loyal to his hometown. He did not want his hometown Virginia to follow in the footsteps of Maryland and rely on the Northerners. Like many Americans of this era, he identified with his hometown more than with the federal government. It's too far. Davis shook his head and said, if we place an order with them now, we will not receive their ship for at least 1 or 2 years. By the time we receive the ship, the Yankees will have sat at the negotiating table to accept our conditions. Davis was ready to go to war with the North, but in Davis's vision, the war between the North and the South would be a short-term war that would be resolved quickly. Davis knew that after the 2 ineffective presidents of Fillmore and Buchanan, the federal government had become complacent. Especially the Army of the North, which was simply vulnerable. I heard that the Atlantic Fleet in the West is now active on the coast of Texas and Mexico. If we are willing to pay, we can buy a few warships from them and hire their crews. Robert Lee still did not give up and continued to advise Davis. Robert Lee thought that Davis was too optimistic about the upcoming war. The military strength of the North was indeed worrying at this time, but the war potential of the North was several times that of the South. Although it was difficult for the North to defeat the South militarily now, the North could afford to lose. As long as Lincoln's attitude was strong enough and the public opinion in the North did not collapse, the North could continue the war. Moreover, Lincoln was not Buchanan. Lincoln's attitude towards the South was tougher than any previous president. Robert Lee did not think that winning a few battles would force Lincoln to the negotiating table. Let's talk about the purchase of ships later. Davis told Robert Lee that he did not want to talk about it anymore. Davis turned his head and said to his secretary, "Telegram General Beauregard to stop the Northern reinforcements from supporting Fort Sumter at all costs, even if war breaks out." Davis also wanted the Confederacy to have a strong fleet, and he also had his own difficulties. Compared with the North and the West, the government organization in the South was very loose. Although both were presidents, Davis had far less power than Lincoln in the North and Liang Zhao in the West. Purchasing warships would occupy funds that should have belonged to the Army. Not every Army general had the mind and vision of Robert Lee. Davis did not want to get into endless arguments with his generals before the war and destroy the unity within the Army. Of course, Davis himself also had the idea of taking a gamble, achieving success in one battle, and promoting peace through war. He himself was more inclined to concentrate all resources on the Army and decide the outcome with one battle. At the same time, Fort Sumter, A fortress on an artificial island was like a lone boat floating alone at the mouth of Charleston. General Beauregard of the Southern Army had already deployed troops and completed the siege of Sumter. 4,000 Confederate soldiers and cadets from the Charleston Military Academy surrounded Fort Sumter. The Union Army originally had 3 military bases near Charleston to form Charleston's defense system. One was Fort Pinckney, but it had been out of service for a long time before the war and was only guarded by a widowed sergeant and his teenage daughter. After South Carolina seceded from the Union, Fort Pinckney quickly fell into the hands of local armed forces. The other fort was Fort Moultrie, which was in a much better situation than Fort Pinckney. It had more than 50 cannons. This fort was the fortress that Lieutenant Colonel Anderson was previously responsible for garrisoning. But compared with Fort Pinckney and Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie had a very big disadvantage, that is, Fort Moultrie was located on land. After learning that South Carolina had seceded from the Union, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, who saw that the situation was not good, believed that Fort Moultrie would be difficult to hold on for a long time, so he took the initiative to abandon Fort Moultrie and led his troops to escape to Fort Sumter. The Confederates were able to capture Fort Moultrie without firing a shot. The last fort was Fort Sumter, the only one still under Union control. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 634, Persuading Surrender. On the top of the fortress of Fort Sumter, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson with cracked lips and his more than 400 soldiers trapped in the fortress were looking forward to their reinforcements. They prayed to God that their reinforcements and supplies would arrive soon. This not-so-strong fortress was now more like a prison for Anderson and his men. Although the food in the fortress could still last for 40 days, due to the blockade of the Confederate Army in Charleston, Fort Sumter had not received clean fresh water for 2 whole months. The reason why the defenders of Fort Sumter could hold on until now was due to Anderson's strict rationing system for fresh water and the very considerable reserves of alcohol in the fortress. Anderson, with a gloomy face, knew that if reinforcements still could not arrive this week, and supplies were delivered to Fort Sumter, he and his soldiers might not even have any alcohol to drink. The morale of the defenders of Fort Sumter was very low, and now the morale of the defenders was barely maintained by relying on alcohol and his own prestige, and it did not collapse. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson dared not think about what terrible things would happen to Fort Sumter after losing the supply of fresh water and alcohol. He knew that without material support, his personal prestige would be worthless in the eyes of these big-headed soldiers. Anderson observed the artillery positions of the Confederate Army through a telescope. The Confederate Army had set up a total of 106 cannons, and the muzzles of these cannons were all aimed at Fort Sumter without exception. Among the 106 cannons of the Confederate Army, 34 were dismantled from Fort Moultrie, where Anderson was previously stationed. The reason why Anderson was so clear about the number and source of the Confederate Army's artillery was not because of how good his intelligence work was, but because the straight-line distance between Fort Sumter and the Confederate artillery positions on the beach of Fort Moultrie on the east coast was only 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers. As long as it was not foggy or rainy, Anderson could see every move of the Confederate Army on the east coast through a telescope. These days, the Confederate Army in the southeast has been dismantling the cannons of Fort Moultrie and moving them to the artillery positions on the beach. As for the Confederate artillery positions on the west bank, they were even closer to Fort Sumter. The straight-line distance between the two places was less than 400 yards, 366 meters. At this distance, not to mention cannons, even rifles with rifles could easily project metal projectiles into Fort Sumter. Anderson did not regret not destroying the cannons in the military fort when evacuating Fort Moultrie. The situation was urgent at the time. If he had wasted time destroying the cannons, it would have been unknown whether he and his men could successfully escape to Fort Sumter. At noon, Major George of the Charleston Army of the Confederate Army came to the sea near Fort Sumter in a small boat, holding a white flag. The Confederate major asked to enter Fort Sumter to discuss surrender with Anderson. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, soldiers in Fort Sumter, you have been surrounded by our 3 brigades. It is meaningless to continue to stalemate or resist. As long as you are willing to surrender, we will provide you with fresh water and food, and ensure that you can return to the north safely. Major George conveyed General Beauregard's intention to Anderson. Considering that Lieutenant Colonel Anderson was General Beauregard's teacher, Major George's attitude towards Anderson was relatively friendly and polite. "Major George, please go back. Before receiving instructions from our president, I will not give up any inch of territory belonging to the United States, any penny of assets belonging to the United States." After seeing the face of the visitor clearly, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson rejected the request for surrender in a very tough attitude and did not allow the other party to enter Fort Sumter. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson did not want to surrender. He wrote the word of surrender in the letter for help sent to Washington. Anderson was unwilling to surrender to Beauregard without a fight, even though he knew that his student was a kind man who kept his promise and would allow him and his men to return to the North safely. If he surrendered in such a humiliating way, he would become a laughingstock among his colleagues even if he returned to the North, and he would not be able to gain a foothold in the military in the future. Anderson's idea was to discuss surrender with the Confederate Army in Charleston after a symbolic resistance. After all, the enemy was numerous and we were few. In this situation, surrendering after resistance would give an explanation to both the newly elected president and the people of the North. Of course, the most important thing was to give an explanation to his own future. The Confederate command in Charleston was upset when it learned that Lieutenant Colonel Anderson refused to surrender to Beauregard. According to the itinerary of the Northern reinforcements, the reinforcements of the 55th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment would arrive at Fort Sumter within 1 or 2 days, and he did not have much time left. Before receiving the telegram from President Davis, General Beauregard had no idea of attacking Fort Sumter. He hoped to put pressure on the defenders in the fort through siege and force them to surrender. Beauregard knew that once the two sides had a direct exchange of fire, the struggle between the North and the South would immediately rise from the political level to the level of direct military conflict. They, the generals, could provoke a war, but it was not up to them to decide whether to end the war. Although the conflict between the North and the South was inevitable, Beauregard did not want the war to start from him. Moreover, when he was studying at West Point, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson was his teacher. Beauregard still thought of the relationship between teachers and students and gave this former teacher some face, hoping that Anderson could recognize the situation and surrender voluntarily. The next day, Beauregard sent people to Fort Sumter again to persuade him to surrender, and attached a letter of persuasion with extremely harsh words. It can also be said to be an ultimatum to Anderson. Faced with the ultimatum from his former student, Anderson hesitated for a long time and still refused to surrender. Beauregard urged him to surrender so anxiously that Anderson judged that their reinforcements must be arriving at Fort Sumter soon. He had survived for so many days, and there was no reason for him to raise the flag and surrender when the reinforcements were about to arrive. Anderson's judgment was correct. The next morning, a huge fleet flying the Stars and Stripes appeared on the ocean just 2 nautical miles away from Fort Sumter. Needless to say, this must be their reinforcements. The appearance of this fleet excited the embarrassed defenders in Fort Sumter, and their morale was high. They couldn't help cheering and waving to the fleet that was so close. Beauregard received a telegram from President Davis a few days ago. President Davis ordered him to stop all federal reinforcements to Sumter in any way, and had already sent people to strengthen the blockade of the waters around Fort Sumter. The artillery positions on the east and west coasts of the Charleston force were able to completely cover Sumter with firepower, and naturally they could also block the nearby sea areas. The captain of this fleet, Major Fox, carefully observed the artillery positions of the Charleston force on his flagship, the Paulbane, the most advanced steam battleship in the Union Navy. The artillery positions of Charleston had completely blocked the entrance to the entire Charleston harbor. If he forcibly broke through the last 2 nautical miles and tried to enter Fort Sumter, even if he could successfully approach and enter Fort Sumter, his fleet would inevitably suffer heavy losses. Chapter 635, The First Shot of the Civil War. Major Fox went to Charleston alone to negotiate with Beauregard, the Confederate commander of the Charleston troops, and begged Beauregard to agree to their delivery of supplies to Fort Sumter. Beauregard rejected Fox's request and warned Fox that if Fox's fleet tried to approach Fort Sumter, he would not hesitate to fire at them, and hoped that Fox would take care of himself. Fox returned to his flagship, the Paulbane, in a huff, but he did not give up his plan to support Fort Sumter. Fox sent 2 shallow draft, fast steamboats to Fort Sumter to test the reaction of the Confederate Army in Charleston. The Confederates on the Confederate artillery positions on both sides of Fort Sumter saw the two Yankee steamboats approaching Fort Sumter, and they fired without hesitation to drive the two steamboats away. Seeing that the Confederate artillery had blocked the waterway to Fort Sumter, the two steamboats flying the Stars and Stripes drove out of the range of the Confederate artillery in a panic. Major Fox watched all this with a serious look. He knew that Beauregard had shown mercy to his men and only blocked the channel to Fort Sumter and drove away the two steamboats he sent. These Confederate artillerymen were skilled in artillery. If Beauregard wanted to sink the two steamboats he sent, there was no way that the two steamboats could sail out of the range of the Confederate artillery intact. It seemed that they could only wait until night to support Fort Sumter. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson and his men looked at the Union fleet floating quietly on the sea, motionless, and stamped their feet in anxiety and cursed the Navy as cowards. Anderson sent flag signal soldiers to signal the Union fleet to urge the Union fleet to act quickly, but Major Fox ignored it and just looked up at the sun hanging above his head, praying that the moon would not be too bright tonight. At the same time, President Davis' telegrams were sent to Beauregard's desk one after another. These telegrams were either asking about the situation of Fort Sumter and the northern reinforcements, or urging Beauregard to take Fort Sumter at all costs. The newly born Confederate States of America needed a victory to boost the morale of the military and civilians, and it also needed a victory to deter the Northern federal government and force them to sit down at the negotiation table for peace talks. Looking at the Northern fleet anchored and floating on the Atlantic Ocean, Beauregard knew what Fox was thinking. He realized that he could not delay any longer and had to execute President Davis's order. Beauregard once again sent his assistant Major George to Fort Sumter with his handwritten letter to persuade him to surrender. As expected, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson still refused to surrender, but Lieutenant Colonel Anderson still accepted the letter from his former student. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson opened the letter, and after reading it, Anderson was terrified and ordered all the soldiers in Fort Sumter to hide in the underground bunker. At 4 p.m. on March 13, 1861, at the urging of President Davis and the petition of Charleston's military and civilians, especially the cadets of the Charleston Military Academy. In order to avoid more trouble, Beauregard finally made up his mind to seize Fort Sumter by force and ordered the Confederate Army to bombard Fort Sumter, while guarding against the landing of the Northern Army on the coast of Charleston. The Confederate artillery positions fired hundreds of cannons, and the cast iron shells whistled towards Fort Sumter, completely breaking the calm, and the war finally broke out. The local people of Charleston gathered on the shore, waving the star block flag of the Confederacy, watching this wonderful bombardment, and bursting into cheers from time to time. Because of the advance news, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson had ordered his men to hide in the underground bunkers in the fort, so in the first round of bombardment by the Confederate Army, the defenders of Fort Sumter did not suffer casualties. Fortunately, they escaped the first wave of bombardment by the Confederate Army. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the bombardment of the Confederate Army finally weakened. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson heard that the frequency of the Confederate artillery fire had weakened, so he led his soldiers out of the underground bunker and launched a symbolic counterattack against the Confederates. Similarly, the counterattack of the Fort Sumter defenders did not cause any casualties to the Confederates in Charleston. The first casualties on both sides occurred in the 55th New York Volunteer Regiment. In order to cover Fox's fleet to transport supplies and reinforcements to Fort Sumter, Colonel Philip Regis de Trobriand, commander of the 55th New York Volunteer Regiment, launched a feint attack on the Confederate positions in Charleston under the cover of night, making a sign of landing in Charleston. During the feint attack, 2 landing craft were hit by the Confederate artillery, and 18 soldiers of the 55th New York Volunteer Regiment were killed on the spot. Under the cover of the 55th New York Volunteer Regiment, Fox lived up to expectations and braved the artillery fire to deliver 110 reinforcements and fresh water urgently needed by the Fort Sumter defenders to Fort Sumter. It greatly boosted the confidence and morale of the defenders of Fort Sumter. Of course, President Lincoln's handwriting was also sent to Fort Sumter. Anderson read President Lincoln's handwriting under the kerosene lamp as soon as possible. In this handwriting, Lincoln asked Lieutenant Colonel Anderson to hold Fort Sumter as long as possible before the supply was cut off, and allowed him to surrender when he ran out of ammunition and food. Anderson focused on the second half. When he saw that Lincoln allowed him to surrender when he ran out of ammunition and food, Anderson burst into tears of joy and called the president wise. Long live the president. The officers around Anderson were also infected by Anderson's emotions and cried together. At 10 o'clock in the evening, seeing the reinforcements of the Northern Army entering Fort Sumter, the Southern Army artillery increased the intensity of the bombardment. After the police officer had a short rest, Anderson said nothing, and took his men and the reinforcements that had just arrived at Fort Sumter into the underground bunker like a mouse to avoid a bombardment of the Southern Army. With the arrival of the morning, a faint dawn appeared in the east, illuminating the sea area near the Charleston port, which was shrouded in morning fog. The sky above Fort Sumter was already filled with smoke and flames. The Charleston group watching on the shore could clearly see that the fortress of Fort Sumter had been broken under the high-intensity bombardment of their artillery. The bombardment of the Confederate Army continued. At around 11 o'clock in the morning, there was a loud bang, and a huge mushroom cloud rose from Fort Sumter. The Confederate artillerymen were overjoyed, thinking that they had successfully hit the ammunition depot of Fort Sumter, causing the ammunition stored in Fort Sumter to explode. At Fort Sumter, Anderson's adjutant also reported to Anderson with joy that the ammunition depot had exploded and they no longer had enough ammunition to fight back against the Confederate Army. Anderson said lightly that he knew. Chapter 636 Timing 1861. The Confederate Army in Charleston had been bombarding Fort Sumter for a full 24 hours. In just 24 hours, the Confederate artillery poured more than 100,000 shells on Fort Sumter, and Fort Sumter had long been in ruins under the powerful firepower of the Southern artillery. At 4:15, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson took the initiative to negotiate with Beauregard, the Confederate commander in Charleston, for the first time. Anderson asked Beauregard to stop the bombardment and let him and his men voluntarily withdraw from Fort Sumter. After a slight hesitation, Beauregard agreed to Anderson's request, but Beauregard also put forward his condition, that is, he would only give Anderson 1 hour to withdraw. If Anderson's men did not completely withdraw from Fort Sumter after 1 hour, the military personnel who stayed in the fort would be regarded as resistance elements and would not enjoy the treatment of prisoners of war. Anderson agreed to Beauregard's request without thinking much. Upon learning that Anderson had made peace with Beauregard, Major Fox and Colonel Trowbridge were shocked and angry. However, they could do nothing because Anderson had reached a surrender agreement with Beauregard. Helplessly, Major Fox could only send a ship to pick up Anderson and all his men. Since Lieutenant Colonel Anderson had already made preparations to evacuate Fort Sumter, the garrison in Fort Sumter was evacuated in less than half an hour. After confirming that his men had boarded the ship, Anderson personally lowered the stars and stripes hanging on Fort Sumter. The stars and stripes with 35 stars had already been tattered. Anderson folded the flag in a serious manner, held the flag, looked back at Fort Sumter, which had already been in a mess, and boarded the boat that came to greet him with a sigh. As soon as Anderson left, the Confederate Army of Charleston's troops boarded Fort Sumter and raised the stars and stripes at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, the focal fortress that was of great concern to the military and civilians of both the North and the South, finally changed hands. Although a large amount of ammunition was consumed in this battle, the casualties on both sides were minimal. The total number of casualties of the Northern Army was only more than 90, and the number of casualties of the Southern Army was less than 10. Shortly after the Battle of Fort Sumter, both the North and the South could not wait to declare that they had won the battle. The reason given by the South was that they actually occupied and controlled Fort Sumter, expelled the military forces of the North from the territory of the South, and achieved the established military goals, so they were the winners of this battle. The North said that the Federal Army held Fort Sumter in the face of a powerful enemy several times its own, and severely damaged the Southern Army in Charleston. In the end, Fort Sumter was withdrawn when ammunition and food were exhausted. The Federal Army that stayed at Fort Sumter completed their mission perfectly, so the North won the battle. After this battle, Beauregard became the first general in the South to be publicly commended and won the title of Heroic General. In order to keep up with the propaganda, the North also commended and promoted the officers who participated in the Battle of Fort Sumter. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson and his men returned to New York by ship. When New York City learned that their heroes had returned triumphantly from the South, the whole city was deserted. Citizens flocked to the port like a tide to welcome their heroes back. Anderson proudly showed the tattered 35-star flag he brought back from Fort Sumter to the people of New York City and told about his heroic deeds at Fort Sumter. Soon, Anderson became a guest of honor for the dignitaries of New York. In recognition of the heroic performance of Anderson and others in the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln decided to promote Lieutenant Colonel Anderson to Brigadier General, Major Fox to Colonel, and Colonel Trowbridge to Brigadier General after a brief discussion in the cabinet and cabinet members. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson gladly accepted the rank of Brigadier General awarded to him by Lincoln, and Fox and Trowbridge also accepted the new military ranks awarded to them by Lincoln. However, they who knew the inside story of the Battle of Fort Sumter could not be happy. Fox and Trowbridge knew that Anderson was able to escape from Fort Sumter not because of his brave resistance. It was because the commander of the Confederate Army, Beauregard, was his student and gave him a break. If the Confederate Army was determined to attack Fort Sumter seriously, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, no, it should be Brigadier General Anderson, would not be able to appear vividly on the streets of New York at this moment and be welcomed by New York citizens with such high standards. In Sacramento, the capital of the American Republic, in the President's office, Liang Zhao convened his cabinet members for a cabinet meeting. The Battle of Fort Sumter produced 2 federal generals and a colonel. The value of federal generals is getting lower and lower now, Secretary of the Army Elvis couldn't help but complain. In just 1 month, Fox was promoted from a naval captain to a naval colonel, and Anderson was promoted from an Army lieutenant colonel to an Army brigadier general. Such a promotion speed is too shocking. You know, the number of regular troops of the American Republic is larger than that of the Federal Army, and there are only 4 generals in the Army and Navy. In comparison, the Federal Army, which promoted 2 generals in the First War, has too many generals. Liang Zhao smiled and said, Anderson and his ilk are just people who seek fame. It's not that the generals of the Federal Army are getting less and less valuable, but that all officers of the Federal Army are getting less and less valuable. Although Lincoln promoted these 3 people more out of public opinion, the war is imminent and the federal government needs heroes to boost morale and publicize. But it is an indisputable fact that the quality of senior generals of the federal government has been declining in recent years. After the federal government expands its army, this problem will further spread from senior officers to middle and low-level officers. There are many examples of ordinary soldiers with service experience who have been re-enlisted and transformed into lieutenants or even colonels. And these people have not even served as grassroots non-commissioned officers and have commanded small-scale battles before. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, the North and the South have completely torn their faces apart. Chen Baoliang asked, should we announce the Land Act of the American Republic at this time? This is the topic of our cabinet meeting today. Liang Zhao said, from today on, the Land Act of the American Republic will be officially announced to the public. At the same time, call the federal government, and in order to avoid unnecessary conflicts and misunderstandings between the East and the West, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska territory except the North Platte Valley. These 5 territories will be set as demilitarized zones as a buffer zone between the East and the West. In the Land Act of the American Republic, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma are in the sphere of influence of the Northern Federation. Therefore, Liang Zhao did not announce the Land Act of the American Republic to the public immediately after the passage of the Land Act of the American Republic by the Congress. He was waiting for an opportunity to announce this bill. With the sound of a cannon at Fort Sumter, there was no room for maneuver between the North and the South, and the time to announce the Land Act of the American Republic finally came. Chapter 637 Where the invaders can go, I can go too. I agree to announce the Land Act of the American Republic at this time, but would you consider prudently setting up North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Nebraska territory, except the North Platte Valley as demilitarized zones to serve as a buffer zone between the East and the West? Foreign Minister Robinson thought for a moment, then stood up and spoke. Lincoln grew up in the frontier area. He knows the importance of the frontier area to the Union and will not give it up easily. If we do this, it will definitely anger Lincoln and make him turn the gun that was originally pointed at the South to the West. If the enemy can go, I can go too. Whoever controls the Mississippi River Basin controls the future of the American continent, Liang Zhao said. The eastern part of North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska territory has fertile land and sparse population. It is a natural granary. How can we give up such a good granary because we are afraid of angering the Union? Incorporating North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska territory into the sphere of influence of the West and carrying out immigration and reclamation was not a whim of Liang Zhao, but a well-thought-out decision. Although the land in the West is vast, except for the Central Valley of California, there is no large plain with an area of more than 40,000 square kilometers suitable for agricultural development. The eastern part of North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska is located in the Great Plains black soil belt of the Mississippi River Basin. The plain area of any of these territories is larger than that of California. Moreover, these territories have only seen a large influx of immigrants from the east after the promulgation of the Homestead Act. Currently, these places are sparsely populated. Liang Zhao is confident that within 3 years, the Western ethnic groups, mainly Han people, will become the main ethnic group in the area. Furthermore, at this stage, the logistics supply of the frontline Western Army, the Western main force of the North Platte Fortress Group, all relies on the Pacific Railway, which is only one railway line for supply. The supply line is not only single, but also very fragile, and the transportation capacity is also very limited. It is unrealistic to rely on the logistics capacity of a railway to defeat the Federation, which is 4 or 5 times larger than itself. If you want to make further progress and narrow the geopolitical difficulties and logistical shortcomings in the competition for North America, the frontier territories in the Great Plains such as North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska territory must be fought for. These places must not only be taken, but also quickly reclaimed and developed. As long as these areas are initially developed, the population will reach the size of Oregon and Liang Zhao. In future wars, the frontline troops will not only be able to obtain supplies locally, but can even recruit soldiers and fight against the federal army locally. Greatly reduce the logistical pressure on the West Coast. If the situation is favorable, these areas can be used as a springboard to further advance, threatening the eastern granary east of the Mississippi River, and compressing the strategic space and war potential of the Northern Federation to the greatest extent. At the same time, controlling the Great Plains west of the Mississippi River can also help the South strategically, preventing the Union Army from opening up the Western Front, dividing the South into two through the Mississippi River, and defeating them one by one. Therefore, from a strategic perspective, the Great Plains in the Mississippi River Basin, at least the Great Plains west of the Mississippi River, must be taken, even if there is a risk of war. Offense is the best defense. If you are only satisfied with occupying a corner of the West and do not make progress, the regime of the American Republic will inevitably not last long. The ending of the Confederate States of America in later generations is the best example. After the Battle of Bull Run, Battle of Manassas, the victorious Southern Army had the opportunity to pursue the remaining courage, attack Washington, and capture Lincoln alive. It's a pity that the Southern authorities were only satisfied with the status quo of independence, had no enterprising spirit, did not transform the victory at the battle level into victory at the strategic level, and missed this opportunity closest to victory. That being said, does our army have the ability to defeat the Federal Army? Robinson still had no idea. After all, the comprehensive national strength of the American Republic was too different from that of the United States. Robinson preferred to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight, and did not want to have a direct military conflict with the North too early. Mr. Foreign Minister, you should ask whether our army is capable of annihilating the invading enemy, Army Secretary Elvis said seriously. Having been immersed in the American military for 10 years, Elvis is very familiar with the current armaments of all parties. In terms of military quality, the quality of the Western Army is currently stronger than that of the South, and the quality of the Southern Army is stronger than that of the North. The foreign wars during the United States period were basically fought by the Southern Army and the Western Army. The Northern Army had been at peace for a long time, and its armaments were slack. Not to mention that there were very few troops and officers who had participated in medium-intensity wars. There were not many soldiers and officers who participated in low-intensity wars such as the war against the Indians. Such an army is not to be feared. The North does have greater war potential, but the North also needs time to transform the war potential on paper into actual war capabilities. Therefore, Elvis believes that if he wants to fight a hot war with the Northern Federation for the 5 territories of North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, now is the best time. Moreover, the military pressure faced by the North on the Eastern Front is much greater than that on the Western Front. Even if the war breaks out, the North cannot go all out and send all its main forces to the Western Front. After the cabinet meeting, Liang Zhao was invited by Sutter to inspect the arsenal on the outskirts of Sacramento. After Liang Zhao was elected President of the American Republic, Sutter took over Liang Zhao's position as Governor of California. California is the most important state in the American Republic, no doubt about it. Therefore, Although Sutter did not join the cabinet, Sutter's status is not lower than that of most cabinet members. The sound of artillery in the suburbs of Sacramento is endless. These are the students of the Artillery Department of the California Military Academy and 2 Reserve Artillery regiments conducting live fire training. We have developed our own rocket based on the Congreve rocket you provided. Sutter led Liang Zhao to the rocket warehouse and introduced it to Liang Zhao. According to the purpose, our rockets can be divided into incendiary rockets and explosive rockets. According to the size, our rockets can be divided into light rockets, medium rockets, and large rockets according to the mass. Rockets below 32 pounds are light rockets, rockets between 32 pounds and 128 pounds are medium rockets, and rockets above 128 pounds and below 256 pounds are heavy rockets. During the Second Opium War, Liang Zhao picked up more than a dozen Congreve rockets used by the British Army from the battlefield and brought them back to California to be copied by the Sacramento Arsenal. The appearance of the rockets during this period was still very rough, and they looked like an extremely enlarged version of the sky rockets he played with when he was a child. Why are there still 300-pound rockets? Liang Zhao glanced at the heaviest rocket, which had a weight of 300 pounds marked on its body. These are custom-made by the Navy, Sutter explained. Sven is such a spendthrift. How much does such a big rocket cost? Liang Zhao couldn't help but curse. Is the Sacramento gun not working or what? This thing is for the Army. Why is the Navy joining in the fun? It won't be expensive if the production volume increases, Sartre said with a smile. Compared to the original British Congreve rocket, how does our rocket perform? Liang Zhao asked. Don't tell you that after tinkering for so long. The performance of the rocket you tinkered with is the same as the original British rocket. Chapter 638 Rocket. Our gunpowder is of better quality than the gunpowder used by the British Congreve rocket, and it is much more powerful. 4 rockets with the same charge, our rocket is definitely more powerful. Sutter held up a 32-pound light rocket with both hands and introduced it to Liang Zhao. In addition, according to your requirements, we have also adjusted the center of gravity of the rocket and installed a new tail fin at the tail of the rocket to make the rocket's flight posture more stable. The finished rockets of different weights that you see now are the best solutions we adopted after countless tests. Our rockets are better than the British Congreve rockets in terms of range and accuracy. Take the 32-pound rocket in my hand as an example. The maximum range of the Congreve rocket of the same weight is between 3.5 kilometers and 4.5 kilometers. The maximum range of our improved rocket can exceed 6 kilometers, and the accuracy is slightly better than that of the Congreve rocket. Liang Zhao carefully looked at the 32-pound rocket in Sutter's hand. The length of the rocket body is about 1 meter, the diameter is about 10 centimeters, and the front end of the rocket is screwed with a blasting warhead. The warhead can be unscrewed counterclockwise according to the thread and replaced with an incendiary warhead of the same specification. The rear end of the rocket is equipped with a 4.8-meter-long balance rod with tail fins. The overall manufacturing process of the rocket is relatively sophisticated, at least better than the Congreve rocket used by the British Army that Liang Zhao has seen. It is also more expensive than the British Congreve rocket, right? Liang Zhao said. You get what you pay for, Sartre smiled. Words are not enough. Let's see if it is a mule or a horse. Liang Zhao couldn't wait to see the actual firing effect of these homemade rockets to evaluate the actual combat performance of the rockets, and then consider whether to set up a special rocket unit. Sartre also understood that although Liang Zhao had many strange ideas, he always attached great importance to the actual combat effect of weapons rather than paper data. He praised the rockets made by the Sacramento Arsenal, but it would be better to pull these rockets to the shooting range for a test firing. Sartre, who had been prepared for this, took Liang Zhao to the test site. 3 organ-shaped carts were pushed out. These carts were launch frames for light rockets under 32 pounds. The workers at the arsenal were nervously and skillfully conducting the final inspection to ensure that everything was foolproof. The launch device was carefully debugged, and Sartre led Liang Zhao back to a safe area. The entire site before the test was very quiet, and only the rustling sound of the wind could be heard echoing in the ears. Launch, Sartre gave an order, and everyone's eyes were focused on the tall rocket. With a sharp whistle from the ignition of the rocket, hot flames spurted out from the bottom of the rocket, thick smoke billowed up, and the rocket rushed into the sky like an arrow from a bow. The rocket rose rapidly in the air, drawing a beautiful arc, and the tail flame dragged a long white smoke in the air. Everyone held their breath and focused their eyes, following the rocket's gradually receding figure, paying attention to the rocket's landing point. As most of the rockets landed in the designated area, splashing smoke and dust, the workers in charge of the test firing could not help but cheer excitedly. Only Liang Zhao was not satisfied with the results of the rocket test firing. Such accuracy could only hit a large number of infantry in line formations and some fixed large fortifications, and could not achieve a relatively accurate strike. Liang Zhao also knew that this was the limit of the technology of this era. Sartre did not exaggerate. The rockets improved by the Sacramento arsenal were indeed more accurate than the Congreve rockets Liang Zhao saw near Balakiao, and the spread was smaller. The smoke slowly dissipated, and the test firing range returned to calm, but the air still lingered with the smell of burning gunpowder. Next to the rocket launcher, the ground was burned by the flames, leaving charred marks. How is it? Our rockets are better than the British ones, right? Sartre rubbed his eyes, which were irritated by the smoke, and said with a cough. Not bad, but the accuracy is still a little bit off, Liang Zhao said. Pull out the 300-pound heavy rocket and fire a few rounds, so I can hear it. Okay, but wait a minute. There is no special launch vehicle for the 300-pound heavy rocket, so we can only build a launch pad on site. Sutter nodded and explained to the arsenal workers beside him. The workers began to prepare for the launch of the heavy rocket. Soon, the skilled workers carefully installed a 300-pound heavy rocket on a special launch pad. The cast iron shell of the rocket arrow shone coldly in the sun, revealing a cold and gloomy metallic luster. Launch. After everything was ready, Sutter gave the order to launch. With a deafening roar, a hot red and yellow flame spurted out from the bottom of the rocket, and thick smoke quickly spread on the ground. The launch pad was almost broken apart by the shock. A few seconds later, the rocket fell heavily back to the ground, exploding into a huge fireball, and hot flames and thick smoke soared into the sky. The shock wave of the explosion swept around with the force of thunder. Flames and thick smoke instantly covered the surrounding area dozens of meters. A wave of heat rushed in the face, and metal fragments flew everywhere. The power of heavy rockets is beyond the reach of light rockets. During this test launch, Liang Zhao even felt a slight tremor on the ground under his feet. It's so exciting, so exciting, Liang Zhao clapped his hands and said happily. Although the accuracy of rockets in this era cannot be compared with that of cannons, the effect of rockets on the morale of enemy troops is much stronger. The artillery of this era cannot move freely on the battlefield with a 300-pound cannon, but a 300-pound rocket can. How many rockets do you plan to buy? Sartre looked at Liang Zhao with expectant eyes. Let's set up a rocket battalion first to see the effect, Liang Zhao said with his hands behind his back. The focus should still be on artillery construction. How are the new recruits of the 2 reserve artillery regiments in Sacramento being trained? Sutter has been responsible for training the militia in the Sacramento area. Unlike other areas, the militia trained in the Sacramento area includes artillery in addition to infantry. The artillery training ground of the California Military Academy is also set up in Sacramento. The new recruits of the Reserve Artillery Regiment are all young people who have received basic education. They learn things quickly. The only thing they lack is practical experience, Sutter said. It's just practical experience. I can't teach them. The Battle of Fort Sumter gradually made the situation in the northern political arena clear. The John Brown uprising that occurred last year once again made the front pages of major newspapers. After this incident, the North formed a call from top to bottom to suppress the rebellion in the South by force and save the Union. This voice has become the political correctness of the North, and the last voice in the northern political arena to resolve differences through peaceful dialogue has been completely suppressed. No northern politician would dare to suggest peace talks and dialogues with the South in the face of such overwhelming public opinion. Chapter 639 War Mobilization. As the strongest and most advantageous party, the Northerners were not only extremely enthusiastic about the war, but also very optimistic. All Northerners believed that as long as the North mobilized for war, they would not only win, but also win in a short time. The population of the North was more than twice that of the South and 4 times that of the West. The industrial output value of the North was 7 times that of the South and more than 3 times that of the West. In addition, the North had abundant natural resources and was very strong in manufacturing. Whether from the perspective of manpower, economy, or other aspects, the North could easily win the Civil War. The Chicago Tribune predicted that the Civil War would end within 2 months. The New York Times even assured their loyal readers that the Northern authorities would resolve the crisis within a month because the strength of the state of New York alone could deal with either the South or the West. Even the relatively conservative Washington Post predicted that the crisis would end before Independence Day, before July 4th. Only a few newspapers with Western capital holdings, such as the New York Evening Post, published inappropriate remarks, saying that all walks of life in the North overestimated the strength of the federal army and underestimated the determination of Southerners and Westerners to defend their homes, and believed that once the war broke out, it would be a protracted war rather than a quick war. The duration of the war would not be measured in months, but in years. However, soon, some newspapers with Western and Southern capital holdings, such as the New York Evening Post, were banned by the federal government for various reasons and had to be suspended indefinitely. Some Republican politicians, including core Republican members of the current government, also predicted the direction and outcome of the war. Secretary of State Seward, the second in command of the Republican Party, believed that the war would end within 90 days. Because according to the Military Service Act passed in 1795, that is, the current military service law, in order not to affect the normal production and life of the people and social order, the maximum service period of the non-reserve troops recruited shall not exceed 90 days. Ending the war within 90 days is undoubtedly the most ideal situation for the federal government, and most people in the Republican Party also have the same idea as Seward. Lincoln also promised the public that he would try his best to resolve this biggest internal crisis of the Union since its founding within 3 months. But unlike Seward and others, Lincoln was not optimistic after learning about the current situation of the Union Army, but was worried. The South and the West inherited most of the elite of the former Federal Standing Army, and the quality of officers was higher than that of the current Union Army. It is obviously impossible to win quickly when the quality of the army and officers is not as good as that of the South and the West. Lincoln also privately reminded Seward and others who were too optimistic about the war many times that the Southern Army and the Western Army were both regular modern armies, and the soldiers in the army might have different personalities, but there was no qualitative difference in ability. Those remarks that one Northern soldier could beat 10 Southern soldiers or 10 Western soldiers were nonsense. In late March 1861, Lincoln officially issued the statement to the states, since the 9 Southern states illegally formed a union in the 3 Western states, which hindered the implementation of federal laws, and the conventional judicial procedures and dialogue methods could not solve this problem, the free states were asked to prepare to voluntarily recruit and dispatch militia to suppress the above illegal union to ensure that the just federal laws can be smoothly implemented in the above areas. The release of the statement to the states means that the war machine of the North has officially started. After issuing this announcement, Lincoln's mood was extremely complicated and heavy. He knew that he could start the war machine of the North, but he could not decide when to stop this huge war machine. He firmly believed that the North could win the final victory in this war, but he could not predict how much it would cost to win this civil war, let alone whether the United States could afford the cost of the war. The release of the statement to the states soon achieved the expected effect. The economically depressed northern free states had a high enthusiasm for the war from top to bottom. The voices of support for the Union and the President surged like a tsunami, and almost all the major cities in the North held large-scale rallies in support of the Union. In New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Pittsburgh and other northern cities, thousands of citizens gathered in the streets, swore allegiance to the Union, and were willing to defend their homes and the unity and integrity of the United States with their lives, property and reputation. Of course, the attitudes of some states in the middle ground after receiving the statement to the states were completely different from those of the northern states. Missouri Governor Claiborne Jackson refused to provide any troops and weapons to the Union on the grounds that this war violated the spirit of the Constitution and undermined the civil rights and freedoms of the states. Kentucky Governor William also issued a public statement stating that Kentucky would never send a single soldier or a single bullet to suppress its compatriots and brothers in the South. At the same time, he privately called Lincoln, saying that although Kentucky would not send troops to assist the Union in suppressing the South, it was willing to provide limited support if the Federal Army went to the West. It is worth mentioning that the statement to the states was boycotted in Maryland, which was the only state north of Washington that resisted conscription. Marylanders condemned the conscription to suppress the South as illegal, unrecognized by the Constitution, and a vicious act without human feelings. At this time, Lincoln's cabinet was arguing over how many troops to recruit. Obviously, It was far from enough to rely on the existing 20,000 to 30,000 standing troops to solve this internal crisis under the current situation. The federal government must recruit troops from the states on a large scale, which is also the purpose of Lincoln's issuance of the Statement to the Free States for War Mobilization. All cabinet members agreed to large-scale conscription, but as for how many troops to recruit, everyone had different opinions. Secretary of State Seward believed that 400,000 talents were needed to quickly end the war before the South and the West completed mobilization. Secretary of the Treasury Chase gave a number of 100,000, Attorney General Bates gave a number of 250,000, and surprisingly, Secretary of War Scott gave a number of 75,000. Laymen watch the excitement, while experts see the doorway. If conditions permit, Scott certainly hopes that as many troops as possible will be involved in the rebellion. The problem is that conditions do not allow it. Scott was the Secretary of War during President Buchanan's term. He knew very well how large an army the federal government's logistics department could maintain logistical supplies for. At this stage 75,000 people was the result given by Scott after careful calculation. Lincoln thought again and again, and finally adopted Scott's suggestion. Lincoln's views were consistent with Scott's. He also believed that the federal government was not fully prepared in terms of military expenditure, logistics, weapons, transportation, and training of new recruits. Blindly expanding the army in the short term is irrational. In addition, the attitude of the upper southern states and some of their regions, such as Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia towards the north is still very ambiguous. Recruiting too many troops at once will make these regions think that the federal government is determined to attack the South, thus causing a fundamental change in their attitude. Lincoln hopes to win these middle ground at the lowest cost. Chapter 640 Issuing Bonds. Just as the federal government in the North issued the letter to the states and officially mobilized for war, the leaders of the Western American Republic held a cabinet meeting on the issue of issuing national debt. Our current financial situation is good, and I don't think it is necessary to issue bonds. The interest alone on a national debt of $15 million is an astronomical figure. Corwin, the first director of the American Republic's Customs Administration, spoke first. Corwin served as the federal government's finance minister during President Fillmore's period. Compared with the federal government's Treasury Department's continuous deficits, the new American Republic's finances are much more abundant, especially after taking back the tariff rights from the federal government. Corwin believes that with the current good financial situation of the Republic, there is no need to borrow heavily $15 million. According to the standards of the Northern federal government, $15 million can arm an army of up to 1.5 million people. $15 million is not a small amount, but it is the fiscal revenue of the 3 states on the West Coast for 2 full years. Robinson stood up and spoke after a moment of silence. The military expenditure of the Second Mexican-American War was not even this much. Although the sound of cannon fire is worth a fortune, the federal government's attention is now on the South, and it has no intention of using force against us. If there is no war between the East and the West, wouldn't it be a waste to borrow such a large sum of money? As Director Corwin said, the interest alone on a $15 million national debt is an astronomical figure. That's because Washington hasn't seen the land bill we issued, said Vice President Fremont. The Land Act we issued includes Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma Territory. After reading the Land Act we issued, Lincoln hated us more than the Confederacy in the South. It's always right to prepare for a rainy day. It will be too late to borrow money when the war starts. I am in favor of issuing bonds. Having said that, based on my understanding of the situation of the federal government does not have the financial resources or the ability to fight both us and the Confederacy in the South at the same time. Calhoun frowned and said, what if there is no war between the East and the West? What should we do with the money? It would be great if there is no war between the East and the West. Liang Zhao picked up the teacup on the table, took a sip of tea to moisten his dry throat, and spoke slowly. The central region is a vast land, and the Mississippi River is flooding. Developing the frontier region is not a matter of giving land to immigrants and then leaving it alone. Building water conservancy projects, laying railways and roads, and settling immigrants, all of which cost a lot of money. Developing the frontier region is a national policy. In this case, I agree to issue bonds. After listening to Liang Zhao's words, Corwin no longer had any objections. Corwin knew how important it was to control this central frontier region. President, I have something to say. Finance Minister Deng Wenyu stood up worriedly and suggested, should we reduce the bond issuance quota? This is the first time our country has issued bonds. If this $15 million bond cannot be issued, our country will lose face. If we can't even issue this mere $15 million bond, I don't think it's because our people don't have confidence in us, but because you don't have confidence in the new government. Liang Zhao looked around at everyone and said with a fake smile. Liang Zhao's purpose of issuing bonds this time was not only to raise military funds and develop the frontier areas in the central region, but also to take this opportunity to tie the entire West, especially the high-level elites in the West, to the chariot of the Republic of America. After 3 cabinet meetings, President's Secretary Zeiss handed a telegram that had just been delivered to Liang Zhao. Mr. President, a telegram from Houston. A telegram from Houston? From Bell and others. Liang Zhao rubbed his temple and asked. No, it was sent by the Rothschild family. Zeiss replied, Britain, France and Spain will declare war on Mexico soon, and French Emperor Napoleon I will personally go to Mexico to collect debts. Mexico is really blessed, with 3 great powers serving a small country in North America. Liang Zhao smiled when he heard this. North America is getting more and more lively. Should we call Hawk to ask his Mexican brigade to temporarily postpone its departure to North Platte and stay on guard at the Mexican border? Zeiss asked. No need. North Platte is the place to use troops right now. Liang Zhao thought for a moment and said, Britain, France and Spain are not of one mind. The British and Spanish sent troops to Mexico to collect debts. Napoleon III's personal expedition to Mexico is not just for collecting debts. Does France need this? You mean, the French army wants to occupy Mexico directly? Zeiss said. Can we also take this opportunity to send troops to Mexico? It's not worth it to vent anger on Britain and France for a little bit of land in Mexico at this time. Liang Zhao shook his head and said, France and Mexico are separated by the Atlantic Ocean. Even if the French army conquers Mexico, it will be difficult to occupy Mexico for a long time, and Britain will not sit idly by and watch France eat alone. It's better to do him a favor. Liang Zhao knew what Napoleon III was thinking. He just wanted to take this opportunity to occupy Mexico and then get involved in the Americas. But Napoleon III's appetite was too big. He wanted to eat up the whole of Mexico, or to eat up Mexico in a hurry by directly occupying it, which turned a good move into a bad one. Tomorrow is the day for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the Jinshan Naval Academy. Will you go to the Naval Academy in person to cut the ribbon? Zeiss asked. The opening of the Naval Academy is a big event. I will go there in person on a special train, Liang Zhao said. At the end of March 1861, after Lincoln issued the statement to the states, young and middle-aged people from northern states responded and signed up for the army. In less than 3 days, the 75,000 conscription quotas were filled. The young and middle-aged people who failed to successfully sign up for the army could not help but beat their chests and stamp their feet, lamenting that they had missed the great opportunity to serve the country and make achievements, and could only leave in disappointment. Lincoln immediately ordered the 75,000-man army to enter Washington. In the past 2 weeks, Lincoln had been in a state of nervousness and anxiety. Although the militias of New York and Pennsylvania controlled Maryland, the slaveholders in Maryland still took advantage of the night to destroy the railway and telegraph lines connecting Washington to the north. The slaveholders in Virginia frequently crossed the border to attack Washington's military outposts for provocation. What Lincoln did most often these days was to pace back and forth in the somewhat dilapidated White House, looking towards the Potomac River from time to time, hoping to see a troop transport ship appear on the Potomac River. Every day in Washington, there was news that the newly formed New York 7th Corps, the Rhode Island Corps, and the Massachusetts 6th Corps were about to arrive in Washington. But these news were always proven to be rumors at night. Not to mention a corps, not even a single Northern Army soldier could be seen on the Potomac River. Now it is not just the people of Washington who do not believe that the legendary 6th Corps, the 7th Officer, and the Rhode Island Corps will arrive in Washington soon. Even the gentlemen in Washington are a little shaken. A few weak-willed congressmen even packed up their gold and silver and fled to the north at night. It was not until April 3rd that a group of Northern Army soldiers, who were in dishevel, riding on a variety of civilian ships and looking very embarrassed, finally appeared in Washington. The arrival of this army made Lincoln feel relieved. Mr. President, Commander Benjamin Butler of the 7th Army of New York reports to you. Commander Benjamin Butler of the 7th Army came to the White House in a dusty state to report to Lincoln. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 641. We need time. Good, very good, General Butler, you are here just in time. The arrival of the 7th New York Army Corps comforted Lincoln a little. If he had to fight a battle to defend Washington now, at least he had generals and soldiers to fight this battle to defend the capital. The rebels in Maryland, especially in Baltimore, are very rampant. The railway from Wilmington to Washington is completely paralyzed, General Butler said apologetically. I was able to arrive in Washington smoothly by bypassing Baltimore with the officers and soldiers of the 7th New York Army Corps. Lincoln ordered Butler to arrive in Washington within 5 days, but Butler took a full 2 weeks to arrive late. It's good that you're here. Is there any news from other troops? Lincoln said calmly. The telegraph office in Washington has been paralyzed for 2 weeks. During these 2 weeks, I was blind and deaf. It seems that General Dix has not completely controlled the situation in Maryland. There are not many pro-Southern militants near the capital Washington, but these militants hide among civilians to harass the garrison in Washington, kidnap postmen and messengers, destroy the railways and roads leading to Washington, and cut off the telegraph lines. It really caused a lot of trouble for Lincoln. The Rhode Island Corps will arrive in Washington within 1 or 2 days, Butler said. Mr. President, please forgive me for being frank, but this is not entirely General Dix's fault. General Dix has only 2,000 people under his command. It's hard to completely control Baltimore with these troops, let alone completely control the entire Maryland. General Dix has made great contributions to forcing Maryland to stay in the Union and name with 2 militia regiments. Lincoln gestured to the presidential secretary Nickel to show Butler a seat. Since the rebellion, the Union Army has had many more generals, but Lincoln knew that if he wanted to stabilize the situation, he had to rely on Scott, Butler, McClellan, Dix, Mason and other Northern veterans, rather than on speculators like Anderson. Although these Northern veterans were not as famous as the Southern generals, and perhaps slightly inferior in ability, at least they were all tested professional officers, and could be used. What's wrong with those bureaucrats in New York? If the railways don't work, they can go by sea. Scott was very dissatisfied with the performance of the New York state authorities and the Navy. And those guys in the Navy are all rubbish. They can't even guarantee the smooth flow of waterways in Washington, order the naval shipyards in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia to purchase 2 merchant ships with a displacement of more than 1,000 tons each. Within a month, I want to see these merchant ships become usable warships and appear in the Potomac River. If they can't do it, let those useless factory directors get out. Lincoln was angry, and he was also very dissatisfied with the slow-moving bureaucrats in the northern states. The Navy's shipyard needs to get the authorization of Congress to add and modify new ships, Nicholas reminded Lincoln softly in his ear. We have to act in an emergency. By the time we get the authorization of Congress, the Southern rebels will probably have reached Washington. After that, Lincoln looked at Butler again. General Butler, I now appoint you as the commander of the Capital Region to command the garrison troops of the capital. In addition, are there any engineers in the 7th Corps? There are 2 engineering companies, Butler replied. Immediately repair the telegraph lines from Washington to the northern states and restore the communication between Washington and the northern states as soon as possible, Lincoln said, pulling his beard. In addition, the writ of habeas corpus in Washington and Maryland will be revoked immediately. Anyone who violates military control and disturbs public order will be treated as a Southern rebel. Mr. President, there is no relevant provision or precedent for the President to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in either the current law or the past case law. Scott on the side tactfully reminded Lincoln that this move was unconstitutional, hoping that Lincoln, who had just taken office, would use the power in his hands carefully and not give others a handle. Scott, I am very sorry that I have to do this at this critical moment of life and death for the Federation. Lincoln defended himself. If the Federation no longer exists, what is the point of abiding by the Constitution? With the 7th Army and the Rhode Island Army stationed in Washington, the situation in the federal capital gradually improved. Thanks to the efforts of the 7th Army and the Rhode Island Army engineers, transportation and communications between Washington and the outside world were restored. The Land Act of the American Republic, promulgated by the Western American Republic, finally arrived late and was sent to Lincoln's desk. After reading the contents of this Land Act of the American Republic, Lincoln felt dizzy, as if the sky was about to fall. Lincoln considered solving the problem of the West, but due to the situation, he had to deal with the problem of the West after dealing with the North-South problem. Therefore, Lincoln's attitude towards the West was that as long as the West remained neutral, honestly stayed west of the Rocky Mountains, and did not touch his bottom line, he would turn a blind eye to the West. After all, with the state of the federal government at this time, it was not ready to go to war with the South and the West at the same time, either militarily or financially. However, this Land Act of the American Republic has completely touched Lincoln's bottom line, which Lincoln could not accept in any case. Those farmers in the central region can not only provide food security for the federal government, but also provide a much better source of soldiers than urban workers. When necessary, the central region can also become a pressure relief valve for the federal government. To put it bluntly, whoever can effectively control the central region and allocate the resources of the central region will have a better chance of winning this civil war and dominating the American continent. Lincoln convened a cabinet meeting to discuss the thorny issue of the West's attempt to get involved in the central frontier region. All the cabinet members attending the meeting were frowning. Obviously, they were not mentally prepared for this problem, let alone a plan. After reading the Land Act of the American Republic, all the cabinet members were silent. Secretary Scott, can General Mason block the Western Army in the North Platte Valley? Lincoln broke the silence and turned to look at Secretary of Defense Scott, who was gray-haired and had trembling hands. Although we have built Fort Goshen, Fort Cobb, Fort Lexington, and Fort Kearny along the North Platte River and have continuously increased our troops in these forts, due to the rush of time, lack of funds and materials, only Fort Goshen and Fort Kearny have been initially built among the 4 forts used to contain the Western Army from moving eastward, while Fort Cobb and Fort Lexington have not yet been completed, Scott said like a treasure. What's more fatal is that our federal garrison in this area is only 1 brigade of General Mason, and according to General Mason's report, the Western Army deployed in North Platte has at least 30,000 to 40,000 regular troops. At the end of President Buchanan's administration, Scott had realized that the West might be an unstable part of the United States, and he built forts and increased his troops along the North Platte River to prevent any accidents. Unfortunately, Scott's preparations were too late after all. Relying on these hastily built unfinished forts and a brigade of troops, it was obviously impossible to stop the Western Tiger and Wolf Army from moving eastward and ensure the federal government's control over the central border area. Furthermore, the Western Army, with the advantage of the Rocky Mountains, has a commanding position over the Great Plains in the middle of the country, and the initiative of attack and defense is entirely in the hands of the Western Army. 30,000 to 40,000 regular troops? Where do they get so many regular troops? The Secretary of State of the federal government frowned after hearing this number. He even suspected that Scott, the Secretary of War, was exaggerating the strength of the Western Army in order to gain more funds. To mobilize and maintain such a large regular army, they need to effectively control at least 2 million people. Seward was not a mediocre person, but as a native of New York State, Seward spent most of his life in New York. Like most typical Northern politicians, Seward paid more attention to the North-South issue. After all, the North-South issue is the biggest concern of the federal government. It's not that Seward didn't know anything about the frontier areas, but Seward's understanding of the frontier areas was limited to hot spots such as Illinois and Kansas. But Seward's understanding of the areas west of the Rocky Mountains was very limited. After all, these regions have only been in the Union for a decade, less than a generation. Previously, the treatment of the Western Army was the best in the Union, and it has absorbed many outstanding veterans from all over the country, and even some officers. Seward, I can tell you clearly that the population that the West can effectively control is far more than 2 million, Lincoln said solemnly. Lincoln's understanding of the border areas, especially the Western region, is far better than that of other Northern elites. He knows that the problems in the West are as serious as those in the South. The ethnic groups in the West are very different from them, and Liang Zhao is an excellent young leader. Under his leadership, if the West leaves the Union for too long, after a generation, the probability of the Union reuniting this vast territory will be infinitely close to zero. By then, the geopolitical situation in the United States will be extremely deteriorated, and the upper limit of development will be locked. At that time, the European powers can also stir up or even manipulate the political situation in North America at a relatively low cost through the strategic means of offshore checks and balances. This is the situation Lincoln least wants to see. With the original 10,000 plus standing troops and the 75,000 volunteers and militiamen that have just been mobilized, we can now mobilize nearly 90,000 troops. If we are facing either the West or the South, we will have the advantage, Seward said after a moment's silence. But if we fight both sides at the same time, our manpower and financial resources do not allow us to do so. We need to make a choice. Unfortunately, the West and the South are both major concerns, not minor problems, and we have no chance to choose, Lincoln said. Now is the most difficult period for the Union, but I believe that the future is in our hands. We only need a little time, precious time. The Union's population size and industrial scale are far superior to those of the South and the West, and the Union has a higher war potential. What Lincoln needs most right now is some time to allow the American war machine to operate efficiently. Chapter 642, The Three Kingdoms. I admit that the problem in the West is as serious as the rebellion in the South, but everything has a priority. Mr. President, the situation is critical. Whether to send troops to the South or the West first, please make a decision as soon as possible, Douglas stood up and urged. All the volunteers and militia that have been mobilized will be used to defend the capital. After careful consideration, Lincoln made a decision. In addition, issue another mobilization order to mobilize and organize another 100,000 troops as quickly as possible. We have not completely torn our faces with the West, and we can contact and negotiate with them on the ownership of the central border area to buy some time. The changes in the situation in the West disrupted Lincoln's original rhythm. Under the pressure of the rapidly deteriorating situation, Lincoln had to issue a second mobilization order within a short month. Mr. President, it is not difficult to mobilize 100,000 troops, but after we mobilized 75,000 soldiers, the federal finances are almost exhausted. Our current finances are only enough to maintain these mobilized soldiers. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase looked embarrassed. Not to mention that this was the first time in the history of the Federation that two mobilization orders were issued within a month, which was a great test of the organization and mobilization capabilities of these federal bureaucrats. The most fatal thing was that the Federation was still shrouded in the shadow of the economic crisis. The financial situation of the federal government was not optimistic. After losing the two major sources of tariff revenue in the South and the West, the finances of the federal government were even worse. Struggling to maintain an army of about 100,000 people is already the current financial limit of the federal government. It is impossible to mobilize another 100,000 troops even with the lowest standard supply. Mobilize patriots to donate. Use bank policies. Go to Wall Street to raise funds. Issue war bonds. Borrow from other countries, Lincoln said in a very stern tone. No matter what method you use, I want to see this 100,000 troops within 2 months. If you can't do it, you should step down and let others do it. Even though Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase was an old friend of Lincoln, Lincoln didn't look good to this old friend, and seemed to have no mercy on this old friend. Yes, sir, Salmon Chase had to bite the bullet and take up this task. People with simple patriotic enthusiasm don't have much money. It's not that rich people are unpatriotic, but it's very troublesome to get money from these people who don't see the rabbit and don't release the eagle. As for borrowing from other countries, the wealthy countries in Europe are basically monarchies. The kings and prime ministers of these countries hope that the American Republic will be in chaos and then split the North American continent. It's not easy to borrow money from them. This is destined to be a hard job. The southern states are not a monolithic bloc. We can still fight for some states and regions to ease our current political and military pressure, Lincoln continued. The West Virginia gentry headed by Francis Pierpont are very angry about the state assembly's vote to secede from the Union. We must win over these enlightened gentry in the counties and cities of West Virginia. Seward, you and Mr. Francis Pierpont are old friends. I think it's most appropriate for you to do this. In terms of the attitude of winning over the swing states and regions in the South, Lincoln has always been very active and has already taken action. Before Lincoln officially took office, he had contacted Charles Moorhead, the former governor of Kentucky, and revealed that he hoped that Kentucky could continue to remain in the big family of the Union. However, Charles Moorhead, the old fox, still took a wait-and-see attitude, not wanting to offend the North or vent his anger on the South, and did not make a clear statement. At present, Lincoln has won Maryland, a swing state in the South, and the remaining regions and states to fight for are Kentucky, Missouri and West Virginia. Among these three places, the most critical object to fight for is undoubtedly West Virginia. If West Virginia is won, it will not only weaken the strength of Virginia, the largest state in the South, and provide an insurance for the safety of Western Washington, but also prove to the outside world that the Northern federal government is the people's will and the only legitimate government. I will live up to your trust. Seward took up this task very readily. Seward did not know much about the border areas, but he knew everything about the eastern region. The counties and cities in the West Virginia region did not have a tradition of slavery, and they were more closely connected with Ohio, Pennsylvania and New York in terms of economy. These counties and cities were not in the same mind as the Richmond authorities. Francis Pierpont and other local dignitaries were originally loyal to the Union. It was easy to persuade them to defect to the North. Compared with the task Lincoln assigned to Salmon Chase, Seward's job could be said to be a good one. On April 13, 1861, a large multinational fleet appeared in the waters near the port of Veracruz. Some of the ships in this fleet flew the white flag and the Union Jack of the British Royal Navy, or the flag of the Second French Empire and the flag of the Spanish Empire. There is no doubt that this army was the British, French and Spanish coalition forces that went to Mexico in the name of debt collection. The port of Veracruz is one of the few ports in the western Gulf of Mexico that can berth large ships, and it is also the first stop for the British, French and Spanish coalition forces to arrive in Mexico. Sven, the actual controller of the port of Veracruz and the commander of the Atlantic Fleet of the Republic of America, allowed the British, French and Spanish ships to dock at the port of Veracruz for supplies at the instruction of Liang Zhao. After learning about this, the Mexican authorities protested to the American Republic, demanding that the port of Veracruz remain neutral and not allow warships from other countries to dock. However, the authorities of the American Republic did not take the protest of the Mexican authorities seriously and still agreed to the request of the joint fleet of Britain, France and Spain to dock for supplies. On the one hand, these soldiers from Europe can bring rich income to the port of Veracruz. On the other hand, the authorities of the American Republic do not want to vent their anger on the European powers at this critical moment. Sven stood on the dock with his hands behind his back, gazing at this huge fleet and thinking a lot. This was the first time Sven had the opportunity to witness the two most powerful navies in the world with his own eyes. The construction and maintenance costs of the Navy are high, the cycle is long, the personnel training is slow, and the system is complicated. It is the most testing military branch of this era and the embodiment of a country's comprehensive strength. The size and type of ships of Britain, France and Spain can also give a glimpse of their national strength. In terms of fleet quality, the British Empire is naturally the leader among them. Britain sent one of its ironclad ships, the Warrior, to participate in this expedition. The Warrior, with a displacement of about 10,000 tons, stands out among the many ships. In addition to the Warrior, more than half of the British ships are powered by steam, ranging from gunboats with a displacement of 100 to 200 tons, suitable for offshore inland navigation, frigates with a displacement of 2,000 to 3,000 tons, and battleships with a displacement of more than 4,000 to 5,000 tons. There are also other troop transports, logistics support ships and other ships. It can be said that there is everything and the system is complete. However, the scale of the British expedition this time is relatively limited. The number of Marines is only 1 or 2 regiments, and no heavy artillery is carried. It seems that the British really just came to force Mexico to fulfill its debt obligations by force. The facade of the French Navy is 2 Glorious-class ironclad ships with a displacement of more than 6,600 tons. The fleet system is also relatively complete, and the steamization rate is comparable to that of the British Navy. But the scale of the French army is much larger than that of the British army, especially the troop transport ships, which are several times that of the British army, and the number of people must be more than 10,000. An army of this size, let alone fighting Mexico, would be enough to give the Confederacy and the Union a hard time even if it was sent to the north. It seems that the French are just as the president judged. They are not asking for debts, but they are really occupying and controlling Mexico under the pretext of debt collection. After careful observation, Sven felt that the biggest gap between the British and French navies was not on the ships, but in the quality of the crew. The British crew was obviously more skilled and more comfortable in operating the ships than the French crew. When his eyes fell on the 7 or 8 sailing warships of the Spanish fleet, Sven couldn't help but reveal a look of disdain. Compared with the warships of Britain and France, the fleet of the declining Spanish Empire seemed to be from the last century. Chapter 643. Our president has a bad stomach. At dusk, under the golden sunset, The waves of the Gulf of Mexico gently lapped the coast of the port of Veracruz. The black smoke from the battleship's chimney gradually faded, and the off-white sails were slightly bulged by the sea breeze. A middle-aged man of medium build, wearing a dark blue military uniform with gold thread and a tall golden embroidered kepi, walked down the bridge slowly with steady steps to the beat of military music, surrounded by 2 Army and Navy generals. Sven quickly recognized that the naval general surrounding the French nobleman was his old friend General Traumarin. He had also received news that Napoleon III might personally lead an expedition to Mexico. It seemed that this stylish French nobleman was undoubtedly the famous Napoleon III. "Your Majesty," Sven bowed to Napoleon III in fairly fluent French. Traumarin introduced Sven to Napoleon III. Napoleon III nodded slightly, glanced at Sven and asked, "Are the supplies I want ready? The 800 tons of flour, 130 tons of canned meat of various kinds, 120 tons of pickles, 21 tons of sugar, 900 tons of hay, 520 tons of oats, 2,000 waxed canvas tents, 3,000 barrels of gunpowder, 5.6 million rounds of Walter rifle bullets, and the 3,800 mules and horses you wanted are all ready for you. All kinds of supplies are stored in the warehouse at the port, and the mules and horses are fostered in the farms of nearby farmers. This is the list, please take a look." Sven handed over the list and added, "Our president has instructed that if your army is stationed in the port of Veracruz, we can provide your army with clean water and fuel for free." "Not bad." Napoleon III praised Sven's work, and he was also quite interested in Sven. "Your French is good." "Are you French?" "Not having the blessing to become your Majesty's subject is one of the most regrettable things in my life," Sven said very frankly. "My mother was a prostitute in the port of Aarhus. I should be considered Danish. When I was very young, I became a chores on the ship for a living, and later became a sailor. I learned a little bit of the languages of various countries through osmosis." As Sven spoke, he led Napoleon III to a luxurious manor, haciendas, that was carefully decorated. This is a large manor that integrates agriculture, animal husbandry and social life. This manor was built by Carlos Fernanda, a Spanish colonel during the period of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. After Sven led the Atlantic fleet to the port of Veracruz, the descendants of Colonel Carlos Fernanda sold the manor to Sven for a symbolic price of $1. The manor is a combination of typical Spanish colonial style, Baroque and neoclassical style, supplemented by Mexican local cultural elements. In addition to the main house, the manor not only has a complete central courtyard, a church, and is surrounded by high walls, supplemented by towers used as watchtowers. Climbing these towers can observe the situation around the manor. Napoleon III briefly visited the manor. There were large tracts of open space around the manor that could be used as military camps. He was very satisfied with this arrangement. Of course, as a politician, Napoleon III knew that Liang Zhao's hospitality was not just a simple act of hospitality. Mexicans are no worse than us Europeans in terms of lifestyle and taste. Napoleon III glanced at the exotic plants carefully planted in the sculpture garden and said with some interest, "Because the Mexican independence revolution was very incomplete, many aristocratic families in the colonial period still retain their land, wealth and social status. The aristocracy in Mexico still occupies an important position in the social structure after independence and continues to maintain contact with Europe. This makes it easy for the Mexican nobility to maintain contact with the European upper class, both economically and culturally. The Spanish aristocracy and cultural habits also deeply influenced the social structure and aristocracy of Mexico. Because they share similar values, religious beliefs and lifestyles. This makes it easier for the Mexican nobility to be accepted by the European upper class, and there are also many marriages between the Mexican elite and the European royal family and aristocracy. Mexico's neighbor, America, has gradually formed a relatively equal and open society after independence. Although America also has an upper class and a wealthy class, its social structure is more inclined to commercial and industrial capitalism rather than the traditional aristocracy. Therefore, compared with the Mexican elites who prefer to spend their wealth on squandering and enjoyment, the American elites pay more attention to accumulating capital and power in their own country, rather than blindly integrating into the European aristocratic network, although they want to integrate very much. In addition, the early American culture also has a strong anti-colonial and anti-aristocratic color, which makes the American elites often not as natural and smooth as the Mexican nobles when communicating with the European aristocracy. After all, The values of the two are fundamentally conflicting. The United States and Mexico chose completely different paths at the beginning of their independence, and the spiritual outlook of the elites was even more different, which also led to different destinies of the two countries in the future, one becoming a hegemonic country and the other becoming a third-rate country. Mexico was not destined to lose its vast territory and potential to become a regional power in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, but it was destined to lose these lands when it became independent in 1810. A comprador regime that is completely dependent on other countries from economy to cultural concepts is doomed to have no future. Although Sven was only 3 feet away from Napoleon III and heard what Napoleon III said, Sven was not sure whether Napoleon II's words were a compliment or criticism of the Mexicans, or both. When Napoleon III had finished reading, Sven took a scroll from his adjutant and presented it to him with both hands. "This is a gift from our president. I hope you like it." Napoleon III glanced at the exquisite scroll and thought it was a Chinese painting given to him by Liang Zhao. He waved to the two generals beside him to take the scroll and unfold it. Generals Eli Ferdinand Faure and Tramarin, who were accompanying him, unfolded the scroll slowly on the left and right, and a map of the Mexican army's deployment appeared in front of Napoleon III. Napoleon III was slightly startled and came forward to carefully check the Mexican army deployment around Mexico City. He found that not only the numbers and commanders of the Mexican troops stationed in various places were clear and detailed, but even the actual number of the troops was marked next to the unit number. Before the expedition to Mexico, Napoleon III also spent a lot of manpower and financial resources to collect a lot of intelligence about the Mexican army, but the intelligence he collected was too rough compared to the map provided by Liang Zhao. "Your president is willing to give such a delicious piece of cake." Napoleon III waved his hand and signaled the two generals to roll up the map. Liang Zhao had a history of leading troops to occupy Mexico, and he had done so much intelligence work on Mexico. Napoleon III would never believe that Liang Zhao had no interest in Mexico. "Our president's stomach is not as good as yours, and he can't eat such a big piece of cake." Sven smiled. "Your president's gift is too expensive, so I don't know what gift to give back to your president," Napoleon III said casually. He knew that Liang Zhao must have a purpose for asking Sven to provide logistical support for the French army as much as possible and to give him the Mexican garrison map. "Our president said that your condescending trip from Europe to America is the best gift," Sven said. "Please wait a moment, I will prepare a dinner for you." After that, Sven saluted Napoleon III and turned to leave. "Your Majesty, America has always regarded Mexico as its own backyard. Could this Mexican garrison map be fake?" General Faure questioned the authenticity of this Mexican garrison map. "Liang Zhao is not so bold as to fool me with a fake Mexican garrison map," Napoleon III analyzed. "It is true that he regards Mexico as his own backyard, but as Sven said, Liang Zhao does not have such a good stomach to swallow Mexico now. Moreover, the current external environment of the American Republic is very bad. He wants to gain our recognition and even support. I think this is why he is willing to give up Mexico." "Your Majesty is wise," General Faure asked. "The current fission of America is a great opportunity for us to intervene in American affairs. Your Majesty, which of the 4 parties of North, South and West Germany do you think is most worthy of our investment?" Faure is the highest-ranking army general of the French Expeditionary Force. After the war, it is a foregone conclusion that he will be stationed in Mexico as the spokesperson for the interests of the French Empire. Faure wants to know Napoleon II's attitude towards other forces in North America so that he can better carry out work in Mexico in the future. It's called 4 forces, but in fact, it's just 3 forces. Texas is weak and can only rely on one of the South or the West. It's hard to exist as a completely independent political entity, Napoleon III said thoughtfully. "I heard that the American Republic is also preparing for war. They can actually provide us with a large amount of supplies. This surprised me. It seems that they have abundant supplies." At the same time, José Manuel Hidalgo, the ambassador of the Mexican embassy in San Francisco, was as anxious as an ant on a hot pot after receiving an urgent telegram from Mexican President Benito Juárez in Mexico City. He hurriedly took a train to the presidential palace in Sacramento to meet Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao had already learned that the British, French and Spanish coalition forces had arrived at the port of Veracruz, so he naturally knew Hidalgo's intention. He just wanted to borrow money again. As expected, the situation in Mexico was extremely critical. At this time, Hidalgo had no time to think about it. and he directly asked Liang Zhao to provide another loan to Mexico. The allied forces of Britain, France and Spain have already arrived in Mexico. At this time, Mexico has no time to borrow money from other European countries. Looking around, the only one who can help Mexico solve its urgent problems is this good neighbor in the north. Chapter 644 Initiative. Our two countries are friendly neighbors. When our neighbors are in trouble, we should generously help them, Liang Zhao said slowly. So you are willing to provide us with a loan? Hearing Liang Zhao's willingness to help, Hidalgo stood up excitedly and thanked Liang Zhao. I am personally very willing to provide a loan to your country, but your country's credit is really too bad. Liang Zhao interrupted Hidalgo, who was in excitement. Last year we provided you with a loan of $800,000, but your country has not yet fulfilled the contract and paid us even 1 cent of interest. Your behavior makes it difficult for me to explain to my taxpayers. It's not that we don't want to repay your interest, but our country's finances have been really difficult in recent years. After this most difficult period is over, we will definitely repay you in full, Hidalgo vowed to Liang Zhao. Besides, haven't we mortgaged the best port in the Gulf of Mexico, the port of Veracruz, to you? Liang Zhao naturally didn't believe Hidalgo's guarantee. It's better to believe that the Americans don't like oil and the Russians are not interested in their neighbor's land than to believe in the credit of Latin American countries. Although your country's credit is very bad, I don't want to see the lives of my neighbors suffer. Liang Zhao looked very reluctant. As long as your country provides equivalent collateral, we will lend you money as soon as possible. Collateral? Hidalgo frowned and asked cautiously, which port do you like? I can ask our president for instructions. I don't want your land. Liang Zhao shook his head and said, the new territories acquired during the Second Mexican-American War have not been fully digested by the American Republic. Moreover, the British, French and Spanish coalition forces have already stationed in Mexico at this time. The Second French Empire also has a strong interest in Mexico's territory. It is a very unwise choice to nibble away at Mexico's territory at this time. The external environment faced by the American Republic now does not allow Liang Zhao to continue to expand in the direction of Mexico. What do you want as collateral? Hidalgo asked anxiously. Your country can mortgage your tariff rights, road construction rights, and equivalent minerals, Liang Zhao said slowly. The remaining territory of Mexico has a large population. Compared with the previous simple and crude direct occupation, Liang Zhao is more inclined to Mexico to take a more moderate approach to economic colonial penetration. We can't use the tariff rights as collateral, Hidalgo said after a moment of silence. I can report the road construction rights and mining rights to our president and then reply to your excellency. Liang Zhao knew that in fact, Mexico's tariff rights were not uncollateralizable, but had already been spotted by the British. Maybe the representatives of both sides were secretly negotiating at this time. Hidalgo came to him to borrow money not to repay the debt to Britain, but to repay the debt to France and Spain. However, these ignorant Mexican elites have not figured it out yet. The purpose of France's expedition is not to make Mexico fulfill its debt obligations, but to covet Mexico's territory. After Zhai sent Hidalgo away, Liang Zhao returned to the conference room and continued the meeting with the cabinet members. What does Lincoln mean by this? He neither publicly refuted our land bill nor expressed his acceptance of it. Wu Yuanho said, we demanded that North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma and other places be designated as demilitarized zones and that troops be withdrawn from these areas, but Lincoln did not respond. A large number of mobilized soldiers of the Northern Army have entered Washington. I think the communication between Washington and the outside world has been restored, Pans Hengwei said. Lincoln must have turned a blind eye and wanted to delay time. Although the Washington authorities did not respond, their actions have made their attitude clear, Fremont said. The federal authorities have closed the Omaha train station and cut off the Pacific Railway. This move is obviously aimed at us. After the direct military conflict between the North and the South, more and more middle-class and wealthy businessmen in the East chose to go to the West to avoid the war. This allowed the Western region to absorb a lot of high-quality labor and capital from the East in a short period of time. The Lincoln authorities moved to close the Omaha train station and restrict the flow of people from the East to the West to touch Liang Zhao's pain point. This is just one of the reasons, Liang Zhao added. According to the latest intelligence, the federal government has launched a second round of mobilization, and this time the number of people mobilized is 100,000. If they complete the second round of mobilization, the North will have nearly 200,000 troops. Wu Yuanho said dissatisfiedly. What's wrong with those Dixies? They are dithering and not attacking Washington when they have such a good opportunity. Are they going to wait until the North is mobilized before looking for a fight? Or are they waiting for us to fight the North so that they can reap the benefits? I don't know what Davis and his friends are up to, Fremont said, but from what I know about them, they have no interest in the land of the northern states. They just want to be independent from the Federation. In addition, the transportation efficiency of the southern railways is relatively low. I think this is one of the reasons why they have not attacked yet. 200,000. After hearing this number, Cowan, who served as the federal government's Secretary of Finance, shook his head again and again. With the financial situation of the federal government, it is impossible to afford an army of 200,000 unless they open up new sources of tax revenue or obtain support from other channels. There are many European countries that want to intervene in the affairs of America. It is not completely impossible for Lincoln to get the funds for a second mobilization, Fremont analyzed. There has not been a large-scale battle between the Union and the Confederacy, and the outcome is still unknown. There is no reason for the federal government to conduct a second mobilization when the finances are tight. We must attach importance to the federal government's second mobilization. These mobilized volunteers and militia may not be used to deal with the South, but to deal with us, Mr. President. Should we mobilize militias from all over the country to continue to send reinforcements to North Platte to deal with the possible threats posed by the federal army? Deng Wenyu asked. We can't wait for the federal government to take action first. That's too passive, Liang Zhao thought for a moment and said. The federal forts east of North Platte are like a thorn stuck in our throat. If these thorns are not removed, our strategy of developing the Great Plains will not be implemented. Whether Lincoln remains silent, hesitates, or is a delaying tactic, we can't follow their pace. Didn't Stanford and Hawk always want to contribute to the North Platte front? Let them take the Utah Militia and the Western Mexico Militia Brigade to North Platte to await deployment. Napoleon III brought a full 13 infantry regiments this time. Obviously, so many infantry regiments are not here to collect debts from Mexico. Do we really want to hand Mexico over? After the cabinet meeting, Fremont came to Liang Zhao and said. Fremont has always regarded Mexico as his sphere of influence. He felt a little uncomfortable handing Mexico over. We need to open a diplomatic breakthrough in Europe, Liang Zhao said. For us, the best diplomatic breakthrough in Europe is France. We have no more choices. Therefore, it is important to let the French emperor enjoy himself in Mexico. Moreover, with the French colonial model, they can't stay in Mexico for many years. The French army will withdraw sooner or later. Liang Zhao is not worried about France taking root in Mexico. France tends to adopt direct rule in its colonies. It likes to send French officials to directly manage the colonies, regard the colonies as an extension of France, and implement assimilation policies in the colonies to Frenchify the colonies. Compared with the indirect rule and divide and rule cultural policy mainly adopted by Britain for its colonies, the cost of maintaining colonial rule in this French model is very high and difficult to last. Moreover, the life of the Second French Empire is not many years left, so it doesn't hurt to let Napoleon III have a taste of the emperor. I hope it's as you said. Mexico's debt is a huge sum. If Mexico agrees to borrow money with a right to build roads and mining rights as collateral, where will you get such a large sum of money? You don't want to use the $15 million raised by issuing national debt, do you? That's our life-saving money, Fremont said with some concern. The future is uncertain. This $15 million is the ballast stone of our American Republic. I won't touch this money unless it's absolutely necessary, Liang Zhao said seriously. With the British, French and Spanish armies approaching, it's hard to say whether Mexico can survive for a month. If they can get the British, French and Spanish coalition forces to withdraw, it won't be too late to talk to them seriously about this matter then. Chapter 645 Guangxi Soldiers 1861. The Qing envoy arrived at Jinshan. This was the first time that an official Qing envoy went to a country outside of Asia. Finally, a bird in the big bird cage of the Qing dynasty was willing to fly out of the cage and see the outside world. Fifth uncle, why is it you? Liang Zhao was somewhat surprised to see that the Qing envoy was Liang Shaoqian. Why didn't you tell me in advance that you were coming? I could prepare to welcome you in advance. I was not the envoy to visit the United States. It was just that the envoys appointed by the emperor either pretended to be sick or were afraid to take the steamer when they arrived in Shanghai. They delayed their departure for various reasons. The emperor was furious, so I had to go, Liang Zhao said, adjusting the court beads on his chest. But it's good this way. There are no spies from the court watching me during this visit to the United States, so I can be at ease. Is America a tiger's den? Liang Zhao couldn't help shaking his head, and at the same time glanced at the entourage around Liang Zhao and asked, "Are you such a senior official?" For them, the foreign land is more terrifying than a tiger's den. Liang Zhao pointed to several transport ships anchored at the dock. Uncle Wu knows a little about the situation here. Uncle Wu sent you some people, and you must be able to use them. Liang Zhao looked in the direction of Liang Zhao's finger, and saw a group of men with long hair walking off the ship in an orderly manner under the scolding of the soldiers of Liang Zhao's battalion. "Is this the long-haired man you captured?" Liang Zhao asked. "They are not ordinary long-haired rebels. Most of these captives are veteran long-haired soldiers from Guangxi. They have been through many battles and are brave and tenacious. You can train and control them and they will be useful to you," Liang Zhao said. "If Zheng Gufan and Hu Linai had not repeatedly impeached me for harboring the long-haired rebels and having ill intentions, I would not be willing to give you such good captives. These are all good seedlings. It is true that these captives are good seedlings, but it is a pity that I have no relationship with their god, and it is a bit of a headache to train these people," Liang Zhao joked. "What's there to worry about? They are just a bunch of desperate farmers. They will work hard for you if you give them enough food. What's more, your military pay is more than 10 times that of the Guangdong warriors. Many of the Taipings don't believe in the Taipings anymore." Liang Zhao pointed to two men dressed as military officers of the standard camp beside him and said, "These two were Peng Dashan and Zhu Yidian, generals under Shi Dake in the past. I'll give them to you together." Uncle Wu is very thoughtful. "I'll accept it with a thick face," Liang Zhao said as he invited Liang Zhao to get on the carriage. "Uncle Wu, please get on the carriage and come to my house to discuss business." After having tea and food at Tingtao Garden, Liang Zhao and Liang Zhao sat opposite each other and talked about business. "The most important thing for His Majesty is whether you can fulfill the contract for purchasing ships and cooperating in the shipbuilding industry that was finalized last year. If you can, the establishment of diplomatic relations can be discussed," Liang Zhao said. "The warships purchased by the Qing dynasty were originally built by the Jinshan shipyard, and we are responsible for training the personnel. Of course, we can fulfill the contract," Liang Zhao said. Although the Qing dynasty was lame, it was still a major power in the world and the second largest trading country of the Republic of America. Establishing formal diplomatic relations with the Qing dynasty would be of great benefit to stabilizing the trade between the two countries. "That's good, I can report back when I go back. Don't worry about the establishment of diplomatic relations, it can be done." After receiving Liang Zhao's affirmative answer, Liang Zhao nodded with satisfaction. In addition to worrying that the purchase of ships and the establishment of the ship administration would be affected by the political changes in North America, and the deposit paid would be wasted, the Qing Court Center was not concerned about the great changes in North America. "Then I'll have to trouble my fifth uncle for this matter." Liang Zhao took the teapot from Zixing, personally poured a cup of tea for Liang Zhao. "We are all family, so why bother? You are so promising. No matter how difficult the task is, Uncle Wu will do it for you." Liang Zhao took a sip of tea and said, "Uncle Wu will tell you the truth. After meeting you, Uncle Wu will go to Washington and the capital of the Confederate States of America in the South to meet the president and inspect there before returning to report. I guess the emperor intends to establish diplomatic relations with all of you. Then Uncle Wu will have to go to one more place." Liang Zhao couldn't help laughing when he heard this. "Why?" Liang Zhao asked puzzledly. "Uncle Wu doesn't know that Texas also announced its secession from the Union not long ago and established the Republic of Texas." Liang Zhao laughed. "Tisk tisk, the situation in North America is even more chaotic than that of the Qing dynasty." Liang Zhao couldn't help but sigh when he heard this. "Is Uncle Wu's work as the governor of the Two Rivers going well?" Liang Zhao asked about Liang Zhao's recent situation. "Whether it goes well or not, you have to keep doing it. Uncle Wu has no way out at this point," Liang Zhao said. "I am a frontier official who was born as a Juran, and I am very sharp. If it weren't for the court's reliance on me to suppress the Taiping rebellion, and Prince Guang in the court speaking for me, my career would have come to an end long ago." At night, after Liang Zhao was settled down to rest, Liang Zhao began to look through the list of Taiping prisoners Liang Zhao gave him. Although only 2,300 of the prisoners Liang Zhao gave him survived detention, as Liang Zhao said, 80% of these prisoners were veterans from Guangxi, and the remaining 20% were veterans from Zhuangzi and Anhui. Guangxi soldiers, especially those who have been tempered by years of war, are indeed a rare source of high-quality soldiers. After these veterans have completed their training, they are more than enough to be used as field troops. Liang Zhao gave him a big gift. However, Liang Zhao's main forces have been deployed to North Platte. The troops left on the west coast, except for his presidential guard, are all second-line militias. The officers of these militias were originally drawn from the regular troops. Liang Zhao had no way to draw officers from these militias to train these Taiping prisoners of war. He could only send these Taiping soldiers to North Platte first and hand them over to Kruger for training. In late April, Montgomery Blair, the postal minister of the federal government, arrived in Sacramento by special train as the negotiating representative of the federal government. He negotiated with the government of the American Republic on the ownership of the central border area and whether to demilitarize the central area as a buffer zone between the two sides. Federal envoy Montgomery Blair is already waiting outside the presidential palace. "Do you want to see him or not?" in the presidential office, Chase asked Liang Zhao. "No, let Foreign Minister Robinson talk to him." Liang Zhao looked down and flipped through the translated telegram and said, "Lincoln is a good planner. He shut down the Pacific Railway, dispatched troops to Omaha, and sent people to negotiate. How can he negotiate like this? He has no sincerity at all." Chen Lissing sent him a lot of intelligence about the central region in the past few days. The Northern Army General George Brinton McClellan has arrived in Omaha and started to reorganize the army. This made Liang Zhao more determined in his judgment that the army Lincoln mobilized for the second time was probably not used in the South, but in the West. Liang Zhao was determined to win the central region, and he felt that he could not allow a large army to exist around Omaha. The land plan of the American Republic has been promulgated. Now almost all citizens know that there is such a bill. If the promises in the bill cannot be fulfilled, the American Republic will lose not only the trust of 4 million citizens, but also the confidence of 4 million citizens in the Republic. What's more, as a negotiating representative, Montgomery Blair is not enough. If Lincoln was really sincere, he should have sent Seward to talk to him, not Blair. "Excuse me, President, what is our bottom line?" Chase asked Liang Zhao about the bottom line of the negotiation, so that he could convey the bottom line of the negotiation to Robinson. "Use the lack of a bottom line to test their bottom line," Liang Zhao explained to Chase. "Understood," Chase nodded in agreement. Chapter 646, Stationing Troops in Omaha. After a whole day of arguing with Montgomery Blair, Robinson was sure that Blair had no sincerity in the negotiations. The reason was simple. Although there were twists and turns in the whole negotiation process, after both sides had been talking for a long time, Robinson always kept lowering his bottom line, and Blair always agreed to Robinson's request after some bargaining. But once Robinson asked to sign a written document, Blair either avoided the question or shirked it on the grounds that the matter was serious and he did not have such great power and needed to consult the president. Blair has no sincerity in the negotiations and is unwilling to sign any written documents. What he talked about was just verbal agreement. Robinson reported the situation to Liang Zhao. "As you expected, Blair's negotiation delegation is just to delay time. Sending McClellan to Omaha to reorganize the army has already shown Lincoln's attitude." This Philadelphia boy, who was less than 34 years old and was quickly promoted from a staff officer to a general in charge of the army, was by no means a mediocre person. Although McClellan's reputation in the army was not high at this time, he was not optimistic about McClellan. But McClellan was one of the few generals in the Northern Army who was born in a formal school. He participated in the Mexican-American War and visited the Crimean battlefield. He had practical combat experience. With this alone, McClellan has already surpassed many Northern generals. Historically, before the First Battle of Bull Run, McDowell took only 1 month to train 35,000 reserve militiamen of the Northern Army into a field force that could barely fight in the face of gunfire and rain of bullets, which shows his strong organizational ability. Such a person, regardless of his background, can stand out in any era as long as he is given a chance. If Lincoln had not been unable to withstand the pressure of public opinion, he would have had to let McClellan go out without sufficient preparation. In the Battle of Bull Run, The first major battle of the Civil War, the Northern Army might not have been defeated so badly. If we can't talk, then fight. Fight until they beg us to talk. Liang Zhao's attitude was very firm. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, the Southern Army never took large-scale military action against the North again. Liang Zhao was not sure whether it was due to the low organizational and mobilization capabilities of the South, the strategic conservatism of the Southern leaders, or the other intentions of the Southern leaders. But he knew one thing: he could not pin the survival of the American Republic on the Southern Army. Since Lincoln was unwilling to give up the central frontier and demilitarize the central frontier, he would help Lincoln demilitarize the central frontier. The headquarters of the newly established Frontier Military District was set up in Omaha. Since the situation became tense, the frequency of departures at the train station in this small town can even compete with the busiest New York Central Railway station in the United States. Although the capacity of the Omaha train station increased sharply, there was no chaos at the train station, and everything was still so orderly. Train cars of supplies were unloaded and moved into the newly requisitioned civilian houses, because the warehouses in Omaha had been filled up a week ago. McClellan had to requisition civilian buildings near the train station for military use. The city was busy, and the outside was also bustling. The young men who had just put on their military uniforms dug trenches and set up artillery positions outside Omaha under the command of the officers. The faces of these recruits were full of relaxed and happy expressions, as if they were here for a picnic, not for a war. The Northern generals who regarded themselves as the orthodox American army generally looked down on other domestic armies and generals of other armies. The so-called other domestic armies naturally referred to the Southern Army and the Western Army. The Federal Army from top to bottom was immersed in an extremely optimistic mood, although the security alert in Washington, the capital of the federal government, had not been completely lifted at this time. But almost all federal soldiers and civilians, including many federal officers, believed that this was only temporary. As long as the Federal Army mobilized to attack, the situation would immediately reverse. The heroic Federal Army will end this civil war within 3 months. Compared with the current temporary disadvantage, the Federal Army, from generals to privates, is more worried that the war will end too quickly and they will not get military merit. As for defeat, most federal officers and soldiers have never really considered this issue. Sometimes it is painful to be awake, especially when everyone else is drunk and I am the only one awake. McClellan has held many meetings to rectify the atmosphere of underestimating the enemy in the army, but the results have not been good. Long time no battle is the true portrayal of most of the Federal Army. After all, there are only a few Northern Army generals like McClellan who have inspected the Crimean battlefield, participated in 2 Mexican-American wars, and had direct contact with the Southern Army and the Western Army. General Colonel Albert Ames of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment reports to you. Colonel Albert Ames, who had just arrived in Omaha by train, came to the headquarters to report to McClellan. Welcome, welcome. McClellan was very happy about Albert Ames' arrival. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Deputy Commander of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment, reports to you. The adjutant who came with Ames also saluted McClellan with a not very standard military salute. You didn't graduate from a military academy? McClellan frowned and glanced at the well-mannered lieutenant colonel who couldn't even salute. Teacher, Joshua is my adjutant. He's a well-known professor of modern linguistics in our hometown. He volunteered to join the army to quell the rebellion, Ames introduced to McClellan. Ames graduated from West Point University, and McClellan was his instructor when he taught at the school. Linguistics professor. Isn't this nonsense? You put all kinds of people in the army, McClellan said seriously. This is a place for fighting, not a place for gilding. Joshua knows 9 languages, and he is also the most outstanding sinologist in Maine, Ames explained to McClellan. He knew Chamberlain. Chamberlain really joined the army with a passion, not just to gild the army. McClellan's face lightened up when he heard this. He knew Chinese and was proficient in sinology, which was more or less useful. He stood up and stared at the map, thinking carefully. And made a deployment for the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Your troops will be stationed in the western suburbs, and I will give you 1,800 Maine militiamen, and you will be responsible for their training. Ames was his student, and McClellan knew Ames inside and out. With Ames's ability, it was still possible to complete the training of 1,800 people in a short period of time. At present, Omaha City is heavily armed, with 40,000 troops. With 40,000 troops and Mason's brigade stationed in the Kearney Fortress Group, McClellan's troops no longer have a numerical disadvantage against the Western Army. But McClellan was still worried, because his troops only had quantity, not quality. Among his 40,000 troops, there were only 7,000 volunteers, and the remaining 32,000 people were basically militiamen with little combat experience and lack of training. The Western Army's troops were an elite division reorganized from the original Western Brigade. That is why McClellan was very pleased with the arrival of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Volunteers, especially organized volunteers, were troops that he could directly deploy into combat without spending too much effort on training. Moreover, the commander of this volunteer regiment was his student. Chapter 647, The Northern Army's Dilemma. Yes, sir, Ames accepted the task without complaint. Ames knew a little about the situation on the Western Front. He did not think that Mason's brigade and the unfinished fortresses near Kearney could withstand the attack of the Western Army. Judging from the land bill issued by the Pseudo-American Republic government, the Pseudo-American Republic government's ambition to control the central frontier region has been revealed. And the most important hub city in the entire central frontier region is undoubtedly Omaha. Omaha is not only an important transportation hub on the Pacific Railway, but also the most important logistics center and military station of the Federal Army on the Western Front. If he was the commander of the Western Army, he would definitely find a way to capture Omaha. McClellan led his 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment garrison in the western suburbs closer to the front line to show his trust in him. Whatever you need, just ask, I will try my best to satisfy you. McClellan saw that Ames did not underestimate the enemy, and nodded with great satisfaction. After all, he was a classmate of the Western Army cadets at West Point Military Academy, and he had some understanding of the Western Army. Since 1853, many Chinese students have been admitted to West Point and Virginia Military Institute. McClellan had the honor of teaching several Chinese Military Academy students during his teaching at West Point. These Chinese Military Academy students left a very good impression on McClellan. In particular, among the Chinese Military Academy students who graduated in 1856, 2 of them graduated with first and second place, and Ames was the third of that class. To be fair, Ames was already good enough. If he had been in any other class, he would have probably graduated from West Point with first place. Without exception, these Military Academy students who graduated from West Point and Virginia Military Institute from 1856 to 1860 are now serving in the Western Army. This is why McClellan did not despise the Western Army. To be honest, when he first taught these yellow-skinned and black-eyed students at West Point, McClellan still had resistance, thinking that these Chinese who looked very similar to Indians were weak and stupid, and could not graduate smoothly from West Point, which would have a negative impact on the reputation of the school. Unexpectedly, these students were very competitive and graduated with relatively good grades. Here are the firearms and ammunition needed by our regiment. Please have a look. Ames came prepared and handed over a list with both hands. Our regiment's firearms are old and of different models. This is a very serious problem. I hope you can allocate a batch of firearms of the same model to us from the armory. The Northern Army has not participated in high-intensity wars for many years, and its weapons are in disrepair. Even the standard firearms used by his 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment are old and the models are not uniform, which is a big trouble in wartime. In fact, the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment is not an isolated case, and the interests involved are also complicated. Due to the relatively developed industries in the northern states, almost every state has its own military industry. Due to various unspeakable reasons, the reserve armed forces of each state have to give priority to purchasing firearms in their own state. Even if the relevant weapons produced and authorized by the state do not meet the standards, the troops who receive the weapons can only accept it with a pinch of their noses. The procurement of the American Army follows the bidding system during the War of Independence. This system can save military expenditure, but it also has many chronic problems. In order to win the bid, arms dealers often lower the price. With less money, the cost of military supplies provided to the military will naturally be reduced, and its quality can be imagined. The officers of the Federal Army naturally knew the drawbacks, and not all Federal Army officers were in collusion with arms dealers. For example, in 1841, Lieutenant Colonel George Burke of the Navy refused to accept the gunboats delivered by the Washington Navy Yard on the grounds of major quality problems, and took the Washington Navy Yard to court. Although Lieutenant Colonel George Burke provided relevant evidence and brought the chain of serious quality problems to court when he appeared in court, he eventually lost the case. The only troops in the Federal Army that could achieve qualified and unified weapons and equipment were the dozen standing regiments before the war. In this regard, the situation of the Southern Army would be much better than that of the Northern Army, at least in the early stages of the war. Because there was only one large arsenal in the entire South that could provide the Southern Army with batches of standard weapons, the Southern Army had no choice. Alright, McClellan glanced at the list provided by Ames and approved Ames' request. Sir, General Mason's telegram. After Ames left, the adjutant handed a telegram to McClellan. McClellan only glanced at the telegram, crumpled it up and threw it into the trash can. Mason's telegram requesting reinforcements had been sent to him more than once, but at present, there were more new recruits and fewer veterans in Omaha, and McClellan could not allocate extra troops to Mason. Moreover, in terms of strategic significance, Omaha was much more important than Kearney. If Kearney was lost, it would at most be unable to effectively prevent the Western Army from going east. If Omaha was lost, the entire Western Front would collapse. As for the relationship between the Kearney Fortress Group and Omaha, McClellan was not ignorant of it. But he knew that once the troops were surrounded in Kearney, it would be difficult to withdraw, and there was even a risk of being annihilated by the Western Army. At this time, it would undoubtedly be a waste of precious manpower to increase the troops to the Kearney Fortress Group. Compared with the gains and losses of a fort and a city, McClellan believed that maintaining manpower was more important. As long as the second batch of 100,000 mobilized soldiers completed their training and were able to fight in the field, he could block the Western Army in the North Platte Valley. Even if he had to sacrifice his life, after making up his mind to use military means to force the federal forces to withdraw from the central region, Liang Zhao took a train to North Platte. At present, the commander-in-chief of the North Platte Front is Kruger. Kruger is a qualified product produced under the Prussian military education system. He is not very excellent, but he is qualified and competent, and can guarantee the lower limit. After years of actual combat, Kruger also has the ability to command a large-scale battle. In terms of loyalty, Kruger is also trustworthy. Moreover, Kruger's status and treatment in the American Republic are also what the Federation and the Confederation cannot give. Kruger is a veteran-level figure in the National Defense Force of the American Republic, and the Federal Army and the Confederate Army have their own officer corps, and it is difficult for outsiders to gain a foothold in them. The reason why Liang Zhao chose to go to the front in person is that this battle is too important for the new republic. Secondly, the composition of the troops participating in this war is quite complex and diverse. There are not only standing military forces expanded from the original Western Brigade, but also militias from various places, the newly trained Mongolian Cavalry Regiment, the Solon Cavalry Battalion, and even Indian tribal armed forces. He is the only one in the entire West who can control such a complex force. Thirdly, being on the front line can also accurately understand the situation on the front line in the first place, so as to make the best decision. Fourthly, the presence of the Supreme Commander in person on the front line can also boost the morale of the officers and soldiers on the front line to the greatest extent. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 648, What a Perfect Rival. The gentry and wealthy businessmen in West Virginia were still loyal to the Union. The economic base determines the superstructure. With the help of the federal government and the persuasion of local sage Francis Pierpont, representatives of West Virginia gathered in Wellington on April 22, 1861 to hold a conference, and announced on the same day that West Virginia had decided to separate from the secessionist front and join the Confederacy as an independent state. Francis Pierpont, who made great contributions to West Virginia's rejoining the Union, became the first governor of West Virginia as he wished. The joining of West Virginia greatly alleviated the security anxiety of Washingtonians. From congressmen in Washington to ordinary citizens in Washington, they happily took to the streets to celebrate. This was the greatest political victory of the Union since it put down the Maryland Rebellion. The Federal Army successfully dismembered Virginia, the strongest state in the South, without firing a single shot. West Virginia's secession made Richmond furious. In order to prevent the remaining southern swing states from falling into the arms of the North, the President of the Confederate States of America stationed troops on the border between Kentucky and Missouri, despite the opposition of Robert Lee, Beauregard and others, and demanded that Kentucky, which had an ambiguous attitude, immediately make a statement, either secede from the Union or go to war. This move angered the dignitaries of Kentucky, who had originally adhered to the attitude of neither allying with the Union nor with the states that seceded from the Union, and quickly made the decision to join the Union. Although the situation in Missouri, the last southern swing state, was not as bad as Kentucky, and it directly stated its intention to join the Union, the situation was not much better. The Confederate troops ignited Missouri, a powder keg that had been suppressed for decades, and the Union supporters and Confederate supporters in Missouri fought each other. Davis' move was undoubtedly a very bad move, forcing Kentucky, a potential ally, to the Union. Even if Davis did nothing, the worst that could happen to Kentucky was that it would remain neutral. Now, Kentucky has sided with the North, and Missouri is in chaos and has an uncertain future. So far, the South has not won any of the swing states in the South. The strategic plan of the Confederacy to control the Ohio River by occupying Kentucky and then threatening Ohio through the Ohio Waterway has thus come to nothing. Unless the Southern Army can really divide its troops to occupy Kentucky by force, instead of putting 2 or 3 second-line militias that can't even stand in a neat formation on the border to pretend. In the West, one steam train after another is running on the winding rails on the Pacific Railway. As the sky gradually darkens, the afterglow of the setting sun shines on the vast wilderness, dyeing the earth golden. The steam locomotive in front of the train spews out thick black smoke, and the rising black smoke gradually disperses in the air, forming a light and long tail. On both sides of the train are the magnificent scenery of the West, and the steep mountains can't help but make people feel a little depressed. Looking upward, we can vaguely see the mountain tops and the clouds, and the mountain tops are dyed orange by the setting sun. Occasionally, a few birds fly across the sky, embellishing the somewhat monotonous scenery. Passing through the eastern foothills of California, the wooden bridges originally assumed in the steep places have been replaced by more solid cast iron bridges and steel bridges with stronger load-bearing capacity. This scene shocked the Taiping prisoners who were riding the train for the first time. How much steel was used to build this road and bridge? Where did they get so much steel? If this steel was used to make weapons, how many swords could be made? How many cannons could be cast? And the train they were riding now could run faster than a horse with so many people and goods. It was really a wonder. I heard from the guards that the distance from where we set out to that city of Bulail is more than 3,000 miles, and it takes less than 3 days. According to this calculation, this iron ox can travel 1,000 miles a day. Zuyitian counted with his fingers and said in amazement, "Is this iron ox a heavenly thing given to them by the Heavenly Father?" Zuyitian was a senior general of the Taiping army who had followed Shi Dake to fight in various places. Long-term marching and mobile warfare made him more sensitive to distance. The Heavenly Father himself may not have this thing, Peng Dechen, who was standing aside, said disdainfully when he heard the word Heavenly Father. The catastrophe that happened in Xinjiang 5 years ago is still vivid. He has long been disheartened by the so-called Heavenly Father and has seen through the tricks of Hong Xiuquan and the high-level officials of the Little Heaven. Otherwise, he would not have chosen to work for Liang Zhao after being captured by the Guangdong Yuan. I heard that we are going there to fight, or to fight against foreigners, who are not easy to fight. Do you think that Master Liang wants our old Guangxi brothers to be cannon fodder for them? Zuyitian said worriedly. Zuyitian was not afraid of fighting or death, but many of the brothers brought here this time were old brothers from Guangxi. Zuyitian felt that it was a pity to let these old brothers from Guangxi be cannon fodder. If these old brothers from Guangxi were pulled out on the Qing dynasty, as long as they did not confront the elite Guangdong Yongying battalion head-on, they would be a military force that could stand on their own wherever they were placed. Aren't we cannon fodder in Liang Yi's place? Peng Dechen said lightly, looking disillusioned with the world. Although Liang Zhao was much better than Zheng Guofan and was willing to accept the surrendered soldiers of the Taiping army, they were surrendered soldiers and generals after all, and there was a rift between the locals. Liang Zhao naturally could not give them full trust, so Peng Dechen was not very happy working under Liang Zhao. At least not as happy as when they just started the army. Thinking of this, Peng Dechen couldn't help but sigh. Why did the good heavenly kingdom become what it is today? The Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy are really a perfect pair of opponents. In the special train, Liang Zhao could not help but sigh after receiving the telegram that Kentucky joined the Northern Union and civil unrest broke out in Missouri. Davis and the others can't make up their minds? Are the tens of thousands of troops in Richmond kept to celebrate Christmas? Sartre, who was traveling with him, shook his head after reading the telegram. If someone in the South had made up their minds, they would have sent troops to Washington a month ago, even if they only sent 1 or 2 brigades and endured the casualties of 1 or 2 regiments. Washington, a small city, would have been taken down by force. Although Washington is the capital of the United States, it is just a pure administrative center. Washington is not a big city, but a small city with a population of only 30,000 to 40,000. Sartre's words are not unreasonable. The top leaders of the Southern Confederacy are too indecisive and timid. They want to leave the Union, but they are unwilling to kill the Union. The North and the South have come to this point, and it is either you live or I'll live. Is there any possibility of a peaceful separation? There doesn't seem to be a brigade in the South that can continue to fight street battles after suffering casualties of 1 regiment. Liang Zhao counted the numbers of the various Confederate troops, and it seemed that there was no such a fierce brigade in the South. As for Davis, I think he has not yet completely controlled the Southern political arena. Perhaps the moderates in the South still have a relatively large voice. They want to fight, but they are afraid that the war will spread to their own state and affect their own industries, so they are timid. Do we have such a unit? Sartre asked back with interest. It's hard to say. Liang Zhao didn't have a definite answer in his heart. Since he joined the military, he has never fought a battle with very tragic casualties, nor has he fought a serious street battle. Of course, the siege battles against Mexico during the Second Mexican-American War did not count. At that time, the Mexican army surrendered as soon as his troops entered the city, and his troops had no opportunity to practice fighting street battles. Chapter 649, Mason's Rage. Davis and others are too indecisive, and Lincoln is also worried about gains and losses. Sutter commented, Lincoln was only a militiaman for a period of time, not a professional soldier, and his military insights are shallow. Washington is still under the attack of the Southern Army, and it is not a wise move to choose to divide the troops in Omaha at this time. Sutter was very puzzled by Lincoln's division of troops. From a military perspective, Lincoln's arrangement was an absolute failure. As a half-military person, Sutter, who served in the Union Army when he was young, knew very well what the Union Army was like now. The current military strength of the Northern Army has no absolute advantage over the Southern Army and the Western Army. If Lincoln concentrated his forces to fight a decisive battle against either the South or the West, the outcome would be unpredictable. But with such a division of troops, the Northern Army's chances of winning would be even smaller. Sutter racked his brains and couldn't understand why Lincoln made such an arrangement. Lincoln is the president, not the general. He naturally would not consider issues from the military perspective. This is what Scott and others should consider. Liang Zhao took a sip of tea leisurely and asked, how did Lincoln win the election? Sartre lowered his head and thought seriously for a long time before he looked up and answered, this is the most turbulent election since the founding of the United States of America. It is difficult to say what is right and wrong. Many people attribute Lincoln's victory to the internal division of the Democratic Party, the compromise of the upper elites in the North, the lack of strength of his competitors, and the irreconcilable situation between the North and the South, which gave Lincoln an opportunity to take advantage of. But in my opinion, the most critical reason why Lincoln won the election is not this, but that Lincoln won the strong support of the middle and lower class citizens in the North. After hearing Sartre's answer, Liang Zhao nodded with relief. Sartre's answer hit the point. Public opinion is like water. Water can carry a boat, but it can also overturn it. Since Lincoln was pushed to the presidency by the surging public opinion in the North, he was bound to be swept forward by this surging public opinion. He had no choice. Even many senators in the White House Senate are unaware of the current situation of the Federal Army, not to mention the lower middle class people, who have long been brainwashed by official media and public opinion. The federal military strength and their cognition has far exceeded the actual federal military strength. Sartre chewed on Liang Zhao's words carefully. After Liang Zhao's guidance, he suddenly saw the light as if the clouds had been cleared. Lincoln must be responsible to the voters who support him. If he wants to sit firmly on the presidency, even if he knows that there is no chance of winning, he must let go of the gamble and create a tough and glorious image for himself. Yes, the battle can be lost, but the glorious image of Mr. President cannot be damaged. Liang Zhao smiled generously. This is politics, McClellan and Lincoln, these two guys raised by bitches, in the command post to Fort Kearny. Mason, who had read the telegram, was furious and could not help but speak ill of his current superior, McClellan, the commander-in-chief of the Frontier Military District, and the current president. "Damn it. You treated more than 3,000 Ohio boys in our brigade as abandoned children. If these forts I guard are lost, you will not have a good life." When Mason learned that McClellan was sent to Omaha to be responsible for the reorganization and preparation of the second batch of 100,000 mobilized soldiers, his mood was completely different from now. At that time, in his command headquarters, Mason and his colonels and lieutenant colonels cheered happily and even held a party to celebrate. The Kearny Fortress Group is the first line of confrontation between the Federal Army and the Western Army, and the priority should naturally be the highest. According to common sense, McClellan should send reinforcements to Kearny as soon as possible after completing the assembly of some troops. After all, the strength of Mason's brigade alone is too weak to face the Western Army, which has 40,000 to 50,000 field troops alone. What Mason did not expect was that McClellan had been in Omaha for 2 weeks, and the number of mobilized troops assembled had reached 40,000 to 50,000, including many combat-capable mobilized soldiers. Under such circumstances, McClellan still stayed in Omaha and refused to send any reinforcements to him. Every time he sent a telegram to urge him, McClellan always refused to send a single soldier to the Kearny Fort Group on the grounds that the troops were insufficient and the new recruits still needed to be trained. How could Mason not be furious? What was even more infuriating was that he explained the pros and cons to Lincoln, saying that the Kearny Fort Group was the best barrier for Omaha. Once the Kearny Fort Group was lost, the entire area west of Omaha would be flat and undefended, and the fall of Omaha would only be a matter of time. Unexpectedly, Lincoln's reply was only a cold sentence: "Follow McClellan's arrangements." This made Mason's heart half cold. It seems that both McClellan and Lincoln were ready to sacrifice him and his entire brigade of soldiers to buy time for the training of the second batch of mobilized soldiers. Thinking of this, Mason couldn't help feeling pale and powerless and sad. Although he holds a high position and is a brigadier general of an elite brigade, he is still a pawn of the bigwigs in Washington. Mason has also heard some rumors recently. Liang Zhao has a very tough attitude towards Washington, and Lincoln will never give up the border areas. If the situation continues to develop in this way, it is only a matter of time before the two sides go to war. Mason has been captured by Liang Zhao once 10 years ago, and he does not want to be captured by Liang Zhao again. Since the War of Independence, there have been precedents of senior officers being captured by the enemy in the United States, but there has never been a case of a senior officer being captured by the same enemy twice. Is he going to set a precedent of humiliation that has never been seen before and will be difficult to follow? Sir, that bastard McClellan has given up on us. Since they are so cruel and can give up a brigade, why don't we withdraw? Mason's adjutant Falco has obviously been shaken. He was an old man who followed Mason to fight in Los Angeles 10 years ago and was captured by the California Regiment at that time, which is now the 101st Brigade of the Western Army. Falco still had a relatively clear understanding of the fighting power of the Western Army. The Woolian newspapers in the North that had no bottom line and kept belittling the actual fighting power of the Western Army, and the Southern Army could deceive the vast majority of fools, but they could not fool the frontline officers and soldiers who had fought in contact in the Western Army and the Southern Army. "Asshole," Mason shouted and interrupted Falco, "we are soldiers. We must live up to the flag behind us." Even though Mason was now dissatisfied with his superior, Brigadier General McClellan, and even President Lincoln, Mason, who was born in a military family, still adhered to his bottom line and accepted this arrangement. He was a man who attached great importance to honor. He did not want to bring shame to his family, nor did he want the 3,000 Ohio sons who followed him to the front line of Kearny to be unable to raise their heads in the future. Although he himself had once had the idea of abandoning the Kearny Fort Group and retreating to the safer Omaha. Chapter 650, The people in the border areas will suffer more. The train passed through the mountains and arrived in Denver. The terrain began to become gradually flat, and the population suddenly became dense. Liang Zhao last arrived in Denver in 1859. At that time, Denver was still the largest city in Colorado with a population of less than 1,000. After more than 2 years of immigration and development, Denver is now a large settlement with a population of more than 50,000. Even by the most stringent California standards, Denver can meet the standards of a medium-sized city. Along the way, the only settlement with a population of more than 10,000 along the Pacific Railway was Provo, thousands of miles away. It can be seen that the climate in the Rocky Mountains is harsh and the population is sparse. Since Liang Zhao was not here to inspect the development of the border areas, he had no plans to stay in Denver. The person in charge of immigration and reclamation in the border areas was Liang Zhao's third uncle Liang Zhao. The Border Immigration Bureau was located in Denver, which was relatively centrally located, coordinating the resettlement of immigrants in Colorado, Nebraska and Kansas. Liang Zhao learned that Liang Zhao had no intention of staying in Denver, so he temporarily handed over the work to his deputy Pan Bailin, and boarded the presidential train to report to Liang Zhao on the development of the border areas. The railway from Denver to Cheyenne City has been repaired and open to traffic. The development of Cheyenne City is better than that of Denver. Mr. President, can you move to Cheyenne City to guide the work? Liang Zhao smiled brightly. Thanks to the immigration work experience accumulated in Utah, the war in the Qing dynasty, the outbreak of the Eastern Civil War, and the policy inclination of the American Republic, Liang Zhao's immigration work started very smoothly. In the border areas under the actual control of the American Republic, Kruger is the top military official, and the top civil official is actually him, the director of the Border Immigration Bureau, who is responsible for immigration to the border. In the Qing dynasty, his current position is a proper frontier official. Cheyenne City is the former Fort Collins, the second largest settlement in Colorado. After a large influx of Han people, it was renamed Cheyenne City because there was a large lake on the high mountains to the west of the city, as if hanging in the sky. I have military duties to attend to. I'll see when I come back, Liang Zhao smiled. There was no need to beat around the bush in front of Liang Zhao. Is there any difficulty in Uncle Sam's work? In general, the immigration work is relatively smooth, but there are difficulties. Liang Zhao handed the work report and map that he had prepared long ago to Liang Zhao for Liang Zhao to read. In the past 2 years, the Frontier Immigration Bureau has resettled no less than 700,000 immigrants, and no less than 500 settlements of various sizes, of which 350,000 were resettled in western Nebraska, 250,000 in Colorado, and 100,000 in western Kansas. As for people, there is no shortage. As for the money and food needed to resettle new immigrants, the central government's quarterly appropriation, plus the previously confiscated Mormon church property, is enough. The only thing that is tight is transportation capacity. Liang Zhao buried his head in reading the immigration work report provided by Liang Zhao. The report provided by Liang Zhao is very detailed, specifically the source of immigrants, the population of the settlements, the person in charge, and the location of the settlements on the map are all marked in great detail. There are 3 main sources of immigrants for the Frontier Immigration Bureau. The largest source of immigrants is naturally the Han people transported from the West Coast, followed by immigrants from the eastern region to escape the war, and finally the Indians who surrendered. For example, the Cheyenne tribe north of Cheyenne City, the Immigration Bureau even helped them build a city on the spot, taught them farming and manufacturing, and expelled the federal armed forces responsible for clearing out the Indians nearby, allowing them to live a relatively stable settled life. Transportation capacity? Do you mean the transportation capacity of the Pacific Railway? Liang Zhao asked while flipping through the immigration work report provided by Liang Zhao. That's right, Liang Zhao nodded. Many things in the border areas cannot be produced by themselves, and materials are in short supply. The prices here are much higher than those in the West Coast. The new immigrants who have just come from the Qing dynasty can still tolerate it. After all, their requirements are not high. They just want to have a meal and not starve to death. But the requirements of the old immigrants on the West Coast and the immigrants in the East are not just as simple as satisfying their food rations. Insufficient materials will lead to sluggish industry and commerce, and subsequent tax revenue will be difficult to guarantee. Fortunately, the immigrants in the border areas are still mainly new immigrants from the Qing dynasty. These people are easy to control, and we can temporarily maintain the stability of the new border areas. But I think this kind of stability is not what you want. What you want is the prosperous stability of the West Coast. Different immigrant groups have different needs and purposes. For the new immigrants from the Qing dynasty who can maintain a half full and not starve to death, they leave their homes and travel across the ocean for only one purpose, that is, to survive. The needs of these people are naturally the easiest to meet. It is easy to go from frugality to luxury, but it is difficult to go from luxury to frugality. For those old immigrants from the West Coast who have immigrated to America for some time, the purpose of their choice to come to the central border area is not just to meet the most basic physiological needs, but to have higher needs. If the needs of these old money from the West Coast cannot be met for a long time, these people will sooner or later return to the West Coast. More people stay in the narrow West Coast area and roll back, which is indeed not what Liang Zhao wants to see. It must be said that Liang Zhao's horizons have been broadened a lot after coming to America. He has been able to have a deeper understanding that the Republic of America is based on industry and commerce, and agriculture is only the most basic part of the Republic's economy. No one knows me better than my third uncle. I also understand what you said, but the border troubles in the border areas are the most urgent problem to be solved. The transportation capacity of the Pacific Railway still needs to be used by the Army first, Liang Zhao said helplessly. Let the small number of people in the border areas suffer a little more, and when the border troubles are solved, life will soon get better. The mode of transportation with the largest capacity and the lowest cost is undoubtedly water transportation, even in the 21st century. Unfortunately, the central region is blocked by the Rocky Mountains and the endless Cordillera Mountains. There are many small and medium-sized rivers in between, but there is no large river that can directly connect the West Coast region and the central border region. There is currently only one Pacific Railway, the main transportation artery from the West Coast region to the central border region. Although the transportation efficiency of the railway is high, the transportation capacity is very limited. The more transportation capacity the Army occupies, the less transportation capacity available for people's livelihood. This is also the reason why Liang Zhao stopped sending troops to North Platte after recruiting militias from West Mexico and Utah Territory. If he continues to send troops, the logistics will not be able to supply them. The subsequent troops will not only fail to exert their due combat effectiveness, but will become a burden. Liang Zhao is not just drawing cakes. He now gives priority to the Army to use the precious transportation capacity in order to free up this part of the transportation capacity after solving the border troubles in the central region. If a war breaks out, is there a possibility of it becoming a protracted war? Liang Zhao had been holding this question in his mind for a long time. After hesitating for a long time, he decided to throw this question out so that he could have a better idea of the situation. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.